And now please welcome with me my boss, President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, Marianne Gomez-Horta.
Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead because I want to make sure that we have our friends who are following us on our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook page. I'm going to do my best to stick to the script. I wanted to acknowledge first the staff. Thank you so much for all the hard work in putting this trade symposium together. A special thank you to Juan, as well as Stephen Holloway, Michelle Archia, who's been leading some of the social media and handling all the AV with the new team here, and our interns, Alicia Valdez. I'm going to go a little bit off script here and make sure that we recognize all the global leader interns who are here with us today, so that all of you can have an opportunity, if you haven't met them, to please do so. They are our future, so I want to make sure you look at them and you check them out well, because they're going to be our bosses someday. So will the four global leaders please rise? Let me make sure I have you all around here. Linoshka, Karen, Sarah, Alicia in the back, Ricardo. Did I miss anybody? No? A round of applause for our future leaders. So thank you again for joining us for the Trade Symposium. That's our contribution to the Hispanic Heritage Month. We want to make sure that we have a conversation about how Hispanics here in the U.S. have a positive impact in the Western Hemisphere. And we have these opportunities to learn from each other and to also learn from our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. At CHLI, we prepare, connect, and honor leaders. In the spirit of advancing the Hispanic community's diversity of thought, please join me in recognizing some of our board members who are also here. You'll hear from him in a little bit, but a round of applause now for the chairman of the board, the Honorable Chairman Lincoln Diaz-Balart. Angela Arboleda with Herbalife Nutrition, thank you. We were already blessed this morning with his voice. Ray Dempsey with BP America. I will introduce the chairman of this trade symposium shortly, Omar Franco with Becker and Polikoff. And we will probably be greeted by two other board members, so I'm going to make sure that I give them some podium time. We will probably be welcomed later by John Hull of Altria Client Services, and also Susan Santana with AT&T. I don't see him yet, but I know we're going to be joined later by a couple of other ambassadors, so when they're here, we will recognize them at that time. I also want to thank a few other people who helped us with the development of this event by providing their expertise, calling friends who are the experts as well in this area, supporting not only with contributions, but also by helping us with some of the other aspects of our programs. And I'm looking around, I think I still need to get some other board members and advisory council members. So Lakeitha Anderson with RIA Services here in the front row. And Bernadette Hobson with PepsiCo on our advisory council. Thank you. I got to make sure I cover all the bosses. You know, I got to do that first. And who else? Norberto Salinas with Intel with our advisory council. Thank you. I think that's it. Oh, there you are. Maria Luisa Boyce with UPS. Thank you with our advisory council. If I miss anybody else, Juan will cover. Who did I miss? No, I already said Angela. Okay. See, that's how this gets done, right? We're just going to go through this. I already mentioned the interns. So now I'm going to introduce the chairman of this symposium. When this symposium started 7 years ago, it was actually an idea by our two vice chairmen, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart and Congressman Henry Cuellar. They wanted the opportunity to have this type of a dialogue during Hispanic Heritage Month, and that's how it actually started. We're not able to be joined by them today, but they do send their thank you for joining, their regards, and hope that if you ever need them for any other services, to please call on them and the team at CHLI. Before passing this on to Omar, I want to officially introduce him. He is a founding member of the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute. At the time when the organization was founded, he was the chief of staff for Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart. So even though his signature is not on the Articles of Incorporation, there was a lot of love from Omar in all those papers. He is now on our board of directors officially. He is also a former president of the Hispanic Lobbyist Association. He was in the past awarded a grant, which I thought was very interesting to share with all of you. He was awarded a grant by the State Department's Bureau of International Information Programs to participate in a 2012 and 2016 U.S. election and electoral process program in the country of Chile and Paraguay. That gave him an opportunity to share about our American traditions, our passion from Chile as well for human rights, the rule of law, and as well as to talk about the diversity of our program and also the United States, not just in the electoral process, but had the opportunity to talk about other Hispanic organizations as well while he was in those countries. So please join me in welcoming, to kind of kick this off even further, the chairman of our trade symposium, Omar Franco.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you all for being here. This is a great, like Marianne said, this is our 7th symposium. So we're really excited. We have very timely panels on women in trade and NAFTA coming up. So looking forward to that. This symposium brings together international business leaders, experts on trade, members of Congress, foreign and U.S. government officials to discuss issues that affect U.S. global competitiveness. CHLI is committed to strengthening the U.S. Hispanic community by promoting the advancement of Hispanics in all sectors of the U.S. and the global economy. Now I get the distinct pleasure of bringing up on stage someone that, I think the absolute world of, Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart. Lincoln is a practicing lawyer and consultant and was born in Cuba, came to the United States when he was 4 years old. He was a member of Congress, as many of you remember, from 93 to 2011. He served 16 of those 18 years on the Rules Committee and was an absolute master of the legislative process. His most impressive achievement is the passing of NACARA, the Nicaraguan Adjustment in Central American Relief Act, that granted legal status in the U.S. to almost 500,000 immigrants from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Cuba, and other Eastern European countries. Before NACARA, these immigrants were facing possible deportation. After NACARA, they became legal, permanent residents of the United States, and most are U.S. citizens today. To this day, NACARA has been the only major immigration reform since the well-known Immigration Act of 1986 to pass. Lincoln attached NACARA to the D.C. Appropriations Act. He knows the art of negotiation and how to use the rules of the House and Senate to obtain results to impact our society for the better. In 2008, Ileana, my old boss, Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, my old boss, Mario Diaz-Balart, and Lincoln formed the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, to kind of, again, further the advancement of our Hispanic community. But more importantly, and very recently, he has a brand new title, something that I know he's going to be very proud of and cherish forever. The title is that of grandfather. So I please join me in welcoming our chairman, Lincoln Diaz-Balart.
Thank you so much, Omar, for those kind words. And it's such a privilege to be with all of you this morning on this beautiful day in our nation's capital. And I want to thank, as did Marianne, CHLI's leader, our staff, for putting this event together and for the wonderful work that the CHLI staff does. Please allow me to take just a minute to ask for a minute of silence for one of our former interns who recently has left us, but will never really leave us because her example and her legacy will always live on. Some of you may remember that at a gala of ours, we have wonderful yearly gala. I believe it was the gala in 2006. Wendy Martinez spoke on behalf of the alumni. And she was critical and extraordinarily important in creating the Alumni Association. And she was an exceptional woman, an exceptional leader, an exceptional human being. And so let's have a minute of silence or prayer remembering Wendy Martinez. Thank you. Thank you very much. Omar kindly mentioned some of the things that I've been involved with, that I've had the privilege of being involved with. Public service. Public service is the most rewarding of human activities in a democracy. Marianne mentioned that Henry Cuellar and Mario Diaz-Balart are our vice chairman. They can't be here today. Obviously, they wish they could, because there's something called elections in democracy. And the election now campaign is very heated, and so they're in their districts. Mario is preparing for his first debate. Henry, I know, is very active as well. By the way, one thing that for me is a motive of great pride is that we, the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, are really the only bipartisan game in town. And in this very partisan, extremely partisan era that we're living in the United States, the fact that there's an organization, Marianne mentioned, and I've remembered those two, our two vice chairmen, one's a Republican, the other's a Democrat, and that they work together, as does our entire board, the congressional members and the corporate members. They work together. Despite their party affiliations, they have disagreements. We have disagreements, but we come together for the mission of Chile. And I think that in itself is something that certainly I'm very proud of, and that in a way serves as a model of how things should function. Differences are inevitable. Discussions, debate are obviously inevitable and appropriate. But there needs to be the ability to come together to accomplish important matters for our society, whether it's the nation or the world. Omar talked about NACARA, and I'm so proud of having been a part of it. Let me just take a minute, if I may, to talk to you a little bit about negotiation and what I think, certainly in my experience, is part of how you can make major accomplishments. You can get major things done through negotiations. Now, the concept of negotiation itself, and I'm very much looking forward today, as Omar mentioned, to learning about the new trade agreement, the Canada, the United States, Mexico trade agreement. First, I think it's worth commendation to see how the leaders of the three countries were able to come together, and while advocating and fighting for the interests, the national interests of each of the three countries, they came together and they improved an existing agreement and updated it. And I haven't had the opportunity to read the agreement, obviously, but the press reports I've read really are most impressive with regard to major improvements for labor standards, environmental standards, the expansion of the middle class. When we talk about, for example, and I'll mention just a little bit about negotiation, as I say, and connect it to how NACARA and other legislative achievements came about that I was involved with. Obviously, when you have a negotiation, there are the most important thing, as I see it, is know what your top needs are, asks, what you can't leave the table without getting. Now, obviously, there has to be a limited number, because negotiation itself means that your counterpart or counterparts also have top critical needs that they can't leave the table without having achieved. So you can't have a limitless list of top needs, but you can have a couple. And in NACARA, for example, and another very successful negotiation that I was involved with in Congress, some of you may have seen that, for example, despite all the pressures and many other factors with regard to U.S.-Cuba policy, even the President of the United States cannot unilaterally grant the Cuban dictatorship tons of financing, and like, for example, the President did with regard to the Iranian dictatorship. Can't do it with regard to the Cuban dictatorship. Why? Because we made it impossible through law until 3 conditions are met in Cuba. There cannot be political prisoners. There have to be political parties legalized, labor unions, the press, and there has to be an election, multi-party election scheduled. So we put that in the law. Now, I mention that because in the case of NACARA, obviously in South Florida, we had a very significant Nicaraguan community, and they were facing deportation. They're what is known legally as color of law. In other words, the status that allowed them to stay in the United States was running out, and they were facing possible deportation. And so I every day ran across their pain, was encountered by their pain in the community that I have the honor of living in. So obviously they were a key priority for me. And in the negotiation, they were my highest priority. We need to solve the problem of the Nicaraguans. But then there was also, I learned, hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans and Salvadorans, who, by the way, did not reside in South Florida. They resided mostly in Southern California or Northern Virginia. But I learned about their pain, and they became a top priority as well. So when I sat down with my interlocutor, the person who I had to achieve an agreement with before I could continue to persuade others, he needed other things. Fortunately, he wanted some changes that I vastly disagreed with. I strongly disagreed with. To clarify some aspects of a law that he had been the author of the year before tightening immigration law and really doing some things that I felt so strongly against, opposed to, that I voted against the law, and as did Ileana, who was in Congress at that time. But President Clinton had signed that law, and then there had been some court rulings that the author of the law strongly opposed. That gave us leverage. That gave us the possibility of achieving a successful negotiation. Because remember, I said, when you sit down in a negotiation, first, identify your key asks, what you can't leave the table without, and know that your opponent is going to have some key asks as well. If both don't have needs, key asks, there's no negotiation possible. But I was able to, when I sat down with my interlocutor, the author of the immigration law that I vehemently had opposed, fortunately, he had some needs. And I accepted those needs. Nobody ever remembers, by the way, what those concessions were that I made. The almost 500,000 people who were on the verge of deportation and who continue to thank me to this day, and their family members. I remember, Marianne remembers, we were at a CHLI conference in Northern California just a few years back. And the gentleman who was the manager at the restaurant where we were staying, at the hotel, he came up to me and he said, "Can you wait a few minutes here? I'd like to bring my daughter to meet you, because I'd like her to meet the reason why she's an American citizen today and that we are in this country." And like that, there's not a month that passes that someone doesn't come up to me to thank me. No one ever remembers the concessions that we made. They were uncomfortable, but they were certainly worth it to get the accomplishments, to make them a reality. And so those are just some key thoughts. When you're going into a negotiation, identify what your needs are. Make a list of what you're willing to cede, what you're willing to give up. I remember one negotiation where I started by making a major concession. And my goal was to surprise my interlocutors, to make them generous. And it worked. But most of the time, I would start my negotiations by pointing out what the key ask was that I would not cede on, that I would not give up under any circumstances, so that they knew what I was seeking most importantly. And then obviously we began the process of ceding, of giving up things that the other side required. I just wanted to give you those thoughts on negotiation, because I don't know if it's in the program, and before Marianne pulls me off here, I wanted to bring them up to you, and thank you for being here. I wish you a very successful day. We're going to have a fine series of panels, as Omar has stated, and I'm very proud of the board and the leaders of the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, as I am of the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, AKA my boss. So yes, he knows when I start standing up. It's a little bit of time to go. But he had some really good points, a couple of things as I introduce and welcome for the next panel, one on negotiation and the other on public service. So the woman who is going to lead this conversation in Women in Trade is actually also a current corporate leader but was a public service, in public service for, I think it was 15 years, and prior to that with different nonprofits. And so I think in her heart and soul, she still is a public servant, and that's the passion that she brings to the board every day that we meet, and when she chairs the programs committee. So please join me in welcoming the moderator for this awesome discussion, Angela Arboleda with Herbalife Nutrition. The floor is yours, dear.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite the panel to come up and get seated. You have your name tags. Just put them on the floor on the side. Get comfortable, ladies. I am really excited to be chairing this panel. Welcome as they come in. Welcome to the Women in Trade panel. This symposium could not have been better timed. There is all of these different issues that are transpiring between our neighbors in the north and the south. But we're not going to talk about that in this panel. We're going to leave that to the second panel. Instead, what I would like to do is to give voice to the unique experience and finesse that women bring to trade issues, that women bring to trade negotiations. As all of you know, trade is a complex topic. It's about interaction between countries. It's about selling and buying goods between small companies and large companies. It's about negotiation and communication. It is also about give and take. Trade is also a tool used to help countries achieve important issues like human rights, economic standards, and labor issues. Today, you will hear what women do in the field of trade. We will focus primarily on their career, and I will ask them questions about lessons in the trade field and lessons that have impacted your careers and kind of that guide you in your everyday operations. So today you will hear from women in the regulatory field of trade, in the industry, nonprofit, and a large company. So we have a really amazing cross-section of trade perspectives. I will not read their bios because you have them in your program book, but I will introduce them just by name and title. We have Ann Alonso, President and CEO of the American Egg Board. We have Maria Luisa Boyd, Director of Global Public Affairs at UPS and a member of the CHLI Advisory Board. Camelia Massard is Executive Vice President of the Organization of Women in Trade. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, we have Brenda Smith, Executive Assistant Commissioner from the Office of Trade. So help me welcome them all to the panel. So ladies, I'm going to sit down and we're going to have like a little visit. This is how I like to do this kind of conversation so that we're relaxed, and I want to encourage all of you to interact with one another and to interrupt if necessary and to interject, because this is very much a panel about sharing your lessons within trade. And we have lots of young leaders, so I want all of you to be taking copious notes as we are embarking in this conversation. So let's get started. I'm going to give each of you 3 minutes, and I'm going to start with Brenda. Tell us, in quick remarks, give us a quick overview of your career. And future leaders, I'm going to quiz you at the end. What are some of the nuggets that they're going to leave behind based on their career in trade?
Wow, it's always hard to go first, but thank you very much for welcoming me onto the panel. I am currently at Customs and Border Protection, so big agency, big job, lots of opportunity for so many things. My career started here on the Hill, actually, as an analyst, and I am an analyst at heart. And I worked for a very engaged member who was at the end of his career. And so one of his key goals was to mentor people, and taught us how to write, taught us how collaboration and strong relationships were so important. After about 5 years, I went into the executive branch and have worked in a number of different positions, which I think is a key nugget, is to develop your skills from a variety of different perspectives. One of the things that makes the strongest leaders, I believe, is moving from field to field. And so I was at the Department of Treasury, actually as the customs budget analyst. I went on to be in the customs budget office, and then have worked in the office of the commissioner at CBP, in international affairs. I have done strategic planning. I have also worked in automation as well as trade policy and programs, and now lead customs trade mission, which gives me a very broad scope for action and meddling.
Great. Amelia?
My name is Camelia Mazard, and I'm pinch hitting today for our president of the Organization of Women in International Trade. So I'm the executive vice president. And what we are is we are a nonprofit that basically has been around for 30 years, and we have chapters around the world. So we have an upcoming conference actually later this month in Nairobi, and we basically foster international trade. I am the past president of the DC chapter of the Women in International Trade, and that's been around for about 25 years. And we also are primarily focused on membership drives, client development, networking, receptions, but also substantive issues as well.
Luisa?
So thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this panel. And my life and my career has been an amazing journey. And I will say one nugget up front that has helped me, and I'll go a little bit through it, is networking and friendships. And so I have here in the panel good friends. I have a friend, a very good friend that we have known each other now for over 15 years, new friends that I have met. But networking makes a difference, and how you interact with people throughout your journey, it's a difference. And so I grew up living in 5 different countries in Latin America. I'm originally from Colombia, from Bogota, Colombia, and I lived in Nicaragua, Honduras, Panama, Costa Rica. And so I actually was seeing trade as I was living and moving through the continent without really knowing that it was trade, and how it impacted different economies. And then I moved here to the United States, and lived in Arizona for 15 years and led an organization called the Border Trade Alliance that represented over 2 million constituents. And it was focused on working on trade, advocating for trade, the movement of people and cargo between the US and Canada and Mexico. And it was a very passionate, that was my first trip to Washington. I remember advocating about this, and you come with so much passion, and then you realize that if you don't have the subject matter expertise or the technical knowledge, passion will take you so far. And so maybe that was my second nugget. I had the network. I needed to have the knowledge and the subject matter expertise. And trade, as you said, I think, Angela, at the beginning, is such a complex topic. And my next journey was at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And I laugh at this. I know Brenda will laugh at this. When I first started, all my career colleagues were, this person doesn't know anything, right? I mean, what do you know about trade? And we had long conversations, and that maybe my third nugget, that's where you appreciate the importance of the process. So when you talk negotiations, and when you talk about understanding the process, having your subject matter expertise and building your network makes a difference in trade. And I think those are the 3. And then, of course, now I'm with UPS, Director of Global Public Affairs. I'm responsible for supporting our government affairs efforts in Latin America. Never a dull moment. I have been dreaming and sleeping and eating and drinking NAFTA for the past 38 hours. Well, 2 years, but the 38 hours have been fascinating. No more tequila. No, I'm kidding. We were joking about tequila and ice wine and bourbon, but that's separate. I'm not on the camera. But anyway, that's my journey, and it has been an exciting journey.
Great.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mary Ann. So for the past 25 years, my career has been substantially trade, and one of the speakers mentioned in different aspects. So I've done trade policy, trade promotion, trade diplomacy, global public policy, and agricultural export promotion. And I know there's a lot of young leaders here who are looking at their journey, so I'm going to take a little time because I think it's helpful. I started my trade career at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. I'm an environmental lawyer by background. EPA sent me to Mexico to put the flag down for the EPA in a foreign country. So I was the first diplomat for the U.S. For the EPA. And it coincided with the NAFTA. So I went there to do cooperation and technical assistance, and before I knew it, labor and environment were the two key issues. And so I was very, very busy. So every time you heard about environment and NAFTA, I was the person in Mexico greeting all the delegations. We had like 50 EPA delegations there. We had congressional delegations. And so my job was to be the liaison for the EPA in Mexico, on the front lines with the Mexican government, with the, with the private sector, and with all the folks wanting to come see whether or not Mexico was ready on environment in the NAFTA. That was, to me, a life-changing step in my career. And so the next space was the U.S. Department of Commerce International Trade. I worked for the late Secretary Ron Brown, and he appointed me in the White House to start up a global environmental exports program for the United States. And that really opened my eyes to global trade promotion. And so we led trade missions to everywhere around the world: Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Vietnam, Portugal, you name it, we were there. And we were trying to get market access and really trying to get U.S. companies positioned in those countries. And so I think that after this stint, which was a couple years, we were credited with increasing U.S. environmental exports by like 50%. And that was another aspect of the trade journey, which was export promotion. From there, I went to the National Foreign Trade Council, which is one of the preeminent trade associations, one of the oldest in America. And I think that somebody on the panel, on the NAFTA panel, comes from the NFTC. I was the number 2. And my role was really more of helping run it, but I got very involved in a lot of issues with leveling the trading field, or the leveling the playing field, and all those trade agreements, those bilateral agreements that were going through Congress back then. So we had, I remember, Bahrain, Jordan, Peru, the DR CAFTA. And I want to stop at the DR CAFTA one, because there I got very involved in organizing Hispanic Alliance for Free Trade. And if some of you remember the DR CAFTA, that was under a lot of attack by the US Congress. And there was a lot of naysayers, and in fact, when it ultimately won, it won by 1 vote. And what I did was organize Latino leaders to go to the Hill, to USTR, and to really show our support for this agreement. Because why did all these other countries get bilateral agreements, but Central America, who maybe didn't have that type of political prowess and clout, did not? But we won that, and I got to say, Hispanics were a key part of the winning of the DR CAFTA. From there, I went to Kraft Foods, and I was the Vice President for Global Public Policy, much like Maria Luisa, but I was at Kraft Foods. And at that time, Kraft was the #1 food company in the world. And so I dealt with a lot of issues, well, tariffs, tax, and trade, but also issues with supply chain. So, Kraft sourced its cocoa, coffee, cashews from some of the countries around the world that had a lot of challenges in their supply chain, child labor, trafficking, other issues. And so my job was to work on the corporate affairs side with risk and reputation, and making sure that we are positioned correctly with governments and with activists and NGOs in these countries. Which brings me to now. I'm the head of the American Egg Board, and while my job is not trade per se, the egg industry, and I hope you all eat eggs, and I hope you all ate them this morning because they're good for you. But the egg producers of America have had a very strong domestic market. In fact, we're in 94% of people's households. So we don't have a lot of room to grow in the U.S. And so this sector, and under me, we really have championed exports for the egg industry. And so in the past 2 years, we've put together a whole trade promotion, business development focus for eggs. And so we're looking at, We looked at market intel, we targeted countries, we did trade missions, we work with the Foreign Ag Service and the USDA, and a couple of fun things that we've done in the past 2 years. We organized our first egg-only trade mission to Mexico. And the reason that's so cool is because Mexico is the largest consumer of eggs in the world. They're like 350-something eggs per person per capita. And so there we went into their countries promoting eggs. We also went to Cuba. We went with some of the other commodities, soybeans and sorghum and chicken and turkey. And we also went to Dubai this year with the largest food show in the world, and we're waving the flag, the USA Pavilion. Anyway, that's a journey, and I wanted to share it because I do want to go back to my nugget, which is you become much better at trade when you come at it with different aspects. And I was fortunate enough to have done that in my career.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm going to turn it over quickly to Camelia because this question is specifically about why it is important to have women in the field of trade. And ladies, I'm going to ask the same question for all of you. And I want you to think about what was it about you as a woman, either in your current position or in other positions, that made you a key player and a valuable stakeholder. So let's start with you.
So I should say that in my other hat, when I'm not doing OWIT and WIT work, I'm a trade remedies lawyer. So that's primarily international trade dumping, which is always in the headlines, as well as CVD. But these days, it's Section 232, Section 301, tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. So for me, being a woman at the table, I've been involved in women's groups for about 20 years. It just brings a diversity in the viewpoint. So when you're there trying to negotiate a tariff line off of these new sanctions coming in or whatever you're doing, it's really important to have a woman's voice. When I am one of the few women at the table, I find that some of the men, I happen to have 2 male partners, they have this tendency to sort of want to really rush and go to court as opposed to try to negotiate. I find that as a woman, I tend to have a more conciliatory approach, whereas I try to settle or see how can we negotiate this as opposed to initially litigating issues.
Very interesting. Brenda?
So I would echo what Camelia said. And what I see at Customs and Border Protection, a very heavy law enforcement agency, most people are in uniform, carrying a firearm. I'm one of the few women at the table. But really important, first of all, because of the opportunities to recognize in the area of trade, because you don't have to have a particular physical skill set or be comfortable carrying a gun. So that's, for me, has been important in my career path. But I think, building on what Camelia said, the negotiation skills that many women bring to the table. I think the attention to detail and the ability to take the long view. I will tell you that my friend Maria Luisa is outstanding in that, to recognize what the strategic goal is and the path to get there may not always be straight through litigation, but in fact requires using the levers available to you, whether they're front and center or whether in fact you go behind the scenes and you make a strategic phone call to an ally that may have an argument that you can use or may have information that is helpful. I think the other piece of that recognizes the relationships that all of us have, but I think women are particularly good at leveraging that our tent is big, and it needs to be big to come up with those negotiated solutions that you, sir, recognized in your negotiation discussion.
Maria Luisa?
So I have, I agree with Brenda and Camelia. I think for me, in maybe growing up in Latin America and coming through my career, I realized too that I wanted to be at the table recognized as and I have told this to the young leaders, recognized as the best subject matter expert at the table that happens to be a woman, and happens to be a Hispanic woman. But I don't lead with it. And the reason why I do that is because thinking in the long term, I wanna find the best solution. I wanna earn the respect of of everybody around. And then I bring in the back, when unexpected, the advantages of being a woman, right, or being Hispanic, or speaking 4 languages or other things, that brings you added value to the table. And so I have learned in the long term, from my perspective, I open the door. We are all opening doors for the younger generations that are coming behind us. But I also tell the younger generations, be the best, do your homework. Do not lead with that I'm the minority, or I'm the woman, or this. Lead with your expertise and the knowledge that you have. We're opening the doors, and make certain, because your good work is going to make a difference. And then comes to with Brenda, how many times we work a phone call, right, or networking, or you know what, we should talk to this person beforehand, or don't jump to conclusions. It's always easy to jump the first thing that you read, and then, oh my gosh, instead of rather go deeper, go beyond, and do that networking. I think that helps a lot. And later I'll talk a little bit more the experience after 9/11, living at the border. We understood that was going to change completely the dynamics of the trade relationship with Mexico and Canada. And some of these skills came to be very useful to make certain that we were able to move through that process.
Anne?
So I think for starters, there's a lot of women now in trade,
Yeah.
and I'm really applauding that. But I want to speak to Latino women,
Yeah.
because I think that was a very strategic advantage for me 25 years ago, when EPA was thinking, okay, we're sending her down there. She's going to go to that culture. Is she going to be able? And not only that, it helped me because of my language and because of my culture. This was my mother's country. And so I saw that was very helpful in terms of working with the Mexican government, and building relationships. In fact, I would be invited to weddings and, quinceañeras. And so I do think that language and cultural skills and being savvy about the people you're working with and living with is really critical. And I think as Latinos, especially with some of the countries that we interact with, is a competitive advantage.
That's great. So now let's switch gears and talk about leadership skills, right? So all of us have leadership skills. What are some of the leadership skills that perhaps are soft skills that you have used within trade? And I want you to take us or give us an example of maybe one time where you were using those leadership skills in a trade setting. So think about it for a few minutes, and I'm going to start with Maria Luisa while the rest of you.
Okay.
I'm going to put her on the spot. Sorry, Maria Luisa.
So, okay, I can do this in 5 seconds or less. No, you send me the question. I knew this. No. So maybe I'm going to go to an example of, maybe not a good example right now. Let's talk about, so working single window. I'm going to use that as an example, maybe. The United States government was making a big change in how we process cargo into the country. There's 47 government agencies that at some point or another require data from information coming in. As in my job at CBP, I was the senior advisor to the commissioner on how to interact with industry. I was also the executive director of the Office of Trade Relations and the ombudsman for small businesses for the agency. To put it into perspective, CBP clears approximately $2.8 trillion of imports a year. Give or take, are we still 2.9 now? 2.9 trillion? And in exports, $1.9 trillion in exports. So imagine the amount of businesses and industries that are impacted. And when we were talking about single window, automating the process, it sounds easy, but then when you start getting into the details, that was a project that was being led by Brenda and her team. Imagine the complexity of changing the whole process. It sounds easier than what it is when you come down. And my responsibility was to bring to the table of the discussion, how do we interact with industry? And there's a technical interaction with the technical piece with the brokers, but there's also the how do you sell the concept and how do you bring all the partners to the table? And I think for me, my leadership skill was to be a listener, read well. You have to have your subject matter expertise, listen, but also not to be afraid to speak up when the time is appropriate. And when we were having very stressful maybe meetings and talking about it, don't be afraid. If you have done your homework and you know what you're talking about, raising your hand and talking about, okay, this is going to impact the small businesses. We need to think through about this area. And I think that has been something that has helped me. And you can do it with a smile without being threatening. I think that's another part that helps sometimes in that piece. And sometimes people feel so passionate. So that helped me through that process. And as a result, we were able to get the consensus from industry, full support and participation. It was painful. I know I shouldn't use that word. It was very challenging. Thank you. I'm sorry. Forget the
Character development.
It did develop a lot of character. It was very challenging, but it set the standard for the rest of the world about how to interact with industry. So we became a best practice. And because of that, I was able to travel around the globe in Asia and Latin America and present in Europe about how to include industry in such a government big program. And so there's even where you're going through the pain and it's hard and the negotiation and all that, at the end of the day, we became a best practice. And that was very useful from that perspective.
That's great. Anne?
So I think generally, just skills or approach is to be curious, to be open-minded and tolerant, to have a sense of adventure, and I want to keep on repeating a respect for the host country. And the example that I was thinking of was when I went to Saudi Arabia. And I think every woman should go to Saudi Arabia for many reasons, but I was there for a big conference, but then also the U.S. Embassy had organized me to speak to, of course, the men in one place and the women in another. And I could tell the men were actually kind of nervous for me because they're thinking, oh my God, she's going to get up in front of all of us, and I did, and I knew my subject matter, and I was also very comfortable with them. And then with the women. But I guess what I would say, and I want to underscore this, is that I'm not there to judge how you run your country or some of the norms or the religious beliefs. And I think that serves you well, especially when you go to countries that are very dissimilar to what we have in the United States. And so for me, that really stayed in my mind as as an underscoring of tolerance, of acceptance, and of a respect for the country that you're visiting.
Brenda?
So the leadership skill that I would highlight is the ability to take risks. I think that's what leadership is all about. If you are a leader, you have to not only get out of your own comfort zone, but you have to take your team, your organization with you when you do that. And the reason that you have to take risks is because we don't make change, we don't grow, we don't develop, we don't do new things if we don't take those risks. And so in order to prepare yourself to take the risks, you have to do your homework, have the technical expertise, read, know your environment. You have to have good relationships when you take risks, because someone has to be there to catch you when you fall or to help you over that hurdle. And then I think the last thing about taking risks is good communication. Tell people what you're trying to accomplish, and talk to them about how you plan to get there. So when you make a mistake, when you forget something, they will tell you because they understand what your vision is and what you're trying to accomplish. To build on to Maria Luisa's story about the single window, before we did all of the work with the industry and the 47 other government agencies involved in this key automation and operational project, I was asked to lead an area that I knew nothing about, and that was customs automation. I didn't know the difference, really, between hardware and software, but I knew the stakeholders, and so was asked to help manage the stakeholders, but ended up thriving as I understood what was at stake, and so learned about servers and how to develop code. Never actually did it myself, but I learned how it needed to be managed. And at the end of the day, because I was willing to take a deep breath and jump off the cliff, we were able to do something not only extremely significant for the United States economy, but also for, as Maria Luisa pointed out, setting the best practice for the entire world. That's the sort of impact you can have as a leader if you're willing to take big risks.
Camelia?
So I'm going to dovetail on what a couple people said. First, I would say attention to detail coupled with the ability to listen. So if you are representing petitioners, for example, you highly monitor statistics and data, whether it's on a quarterly basis or on a monthly basis. And I'll give you an example. So back in 2006, I happened to be in a CEO's office on an antitrust matter. And he was talking about all these products coming in from China, and I don't know how they do it for 50% of the price. And he's like, oh yeah, and Mexico too is also, they're coming in for about 30% of the price. So I just happened to say, maybe you have a dumping case here. And it was just slowly monitoring, and each month we would start monitoring the statistics and look at the input and look at the data. And eventually, in about 3 years, when the time was ripe, we brought a great dumping case, which is in a very arcane area, again, where it was probably the only female, in magnesia carbon bricks. But then at the time, it helped protect the U.S. industry, which was mostly in Pennsylvania and a little bit outside of Chicago, by closely monitoring statistics and data, and also listening when he's saying, oh, these people are killing me here. And then you realize that opportunity or that window to actually help save U.S. jobs.
Great. So now let's move to today. Can you explain the difference between trade negotiations today versus trade negotiations maybe 10 years ago? What, in your opinion, has changed, or what, in your opinion, has stayed the same? What are some of the differences that you notice? What are some of the continuous threads within the field that are important to make trade negotiations come to fruition? Let me start with Anne.
So I was with the grandfather of the agreements, which was NAFTA, and back then, labor and environment and social issues were preeminent in the discussions. I'm not even sure how they're figuring into the USMCA. I haven't studied it. Yeah, but I don't think that they're deal stoppers per se as they were in the past. Maybe because now they're covered and it's not such a monumental issue. But I think that some of the social issues may be different, but I think that fundamentally you have a lot of the same protections and provisions, because what you need to look at these agreements, and I'm a lawyer, so I think this way, they're protections, they're frameworks, they're the rules of the road that you need dispute resolution, or you need issues related to if there's a breakdown or if there's tariffs and there's quotas. So I think that there's a lot of similarities. Of course, we've honed in on some of the industries and what they need or don't need, but I would suspect that, recently there was, Korea, and then there's the current one, and there's going to be a few more. There was also a bigger focus on trilateral, with the World Trade Organization and more of the trilateral areas, and so that might be a little different from what we saw many years ago with all the bilateral agreements that were going through the U.S. Congress.
So let me interrupt here and ask you, and so how is that going to be different from, in your opinion, with trade agreements 10 years from now? So ladies, think about now, yesterday, and tomorrow. So Anne.
It all depends on the leadership. Fundamentally, it goes to who's your leader, who's the head of the U.S. Trade Rep, who's the head of the State Department, and who's your president. I really believe that that might have a lot to do with the way we look at trade and how they're negotiating it.
I think yes, but I also, if I may add, because in the industry that I'm in, from a UPS perspective, the consumer is, you have heard me said this before, consumer is changing how we look at supply chain and how things move. Consumer combined, is that me? The microphone, I'm sorry. No. Consumer combined with technology is what is causing this change. And so it's changing the speed, it's changing the volume. and it's causing regulators sitting at this side of the table to rethink how regulations that were regulating the 20th century way of doing business, how do they regulate now the 21st century way of doing business with consumers that are impatient, right? And the automation and the technology is changing who has access to international trade. That for me is the biggest change that I see from 10 years ago and 10 years in the future. Now, a grandmother, mi abuelita, mi tía, que hace collares, my aunt that makes necklaces in Colombia, she can open up a webpage and sell it to someone in the US or anywhere. But my aunt doesn't know anything about compliance, safety, and regulations, right? Or the dumping, but now, so before, 10 years ago, to your question, we were dealing with bigger companies that will follow the process. They were easily to be trained, et cetera. Now you're dealing with thousands of new players that is helping the economy of the country, because now these are nano and small businesses that are growing and are bringing jobs, right? But that now don't understand the compliance and safety. And so I think trade agreements today and for the future have to reflect those changes, regardless of, I think at some point, regardless of the leadership will have a tone and the voice, but I think there's the practical implementation. For example, in this new trade, this agreement, the US, Mexico, Canada agreement, there's a new chapter for small and medium-sized enterprises. The past NAFTA didn't have a chapter, had an annex that mentioned small businesses and said governments have a year to form a committee to work on small business issues. This one has a chapter, a full chapter with very pointed information, and the sixth part of the chapter talks about, and in all the agreement here's all the things that impact the small businesses. Why? Because there's now that understanding that small businesses have an impact on jobs and growth. So I think it's going to be the politics of it separate. No, I'm not referring to the politics of it separate from that, but the policy piece and the actual practical implementation is going to have a big impact on how we look at trade from now on.
So I'll date myself. I'll go back 20 years ago. When I graduated law school, there were two law firms that did most of the petitioners' work. One was Skadden, and that's who's driving all our trade policy out of USTR, and the other doesn't exist, Dewey. So when you were an associate like myself, we all sort of banded and we did respondents' work. So we represented mostly, the Japanese, the Dutch, the British, the Russians, whoever was bringing in, it happened to be at the time mostly steel. So 20 years from now, you see as our global trading partners change, most of the trade cases now are against China. So as a result, there are probably most firms have switched to doing petitioners' work, and there's about 2 law firms now that represent mostly the Chinese. So as your balance of trade shifts, and also in between there was obviously the whole Canadian lumber dispute, but as your big trading partner shifts, so then goes your ability to negotiate and trade. So you see most of the action coming out of USTR is related to China, whether it's intellectual property or auto parts or you name it. And again, it's sort of saying, as the administration changes, so does your policy towards your largest or second largest trading partner.
But I think one of the things I found really interesting, being part of an executive branch that has really taken a major turn with respect to how it does trade. Those of us that do trade, I think, are passionate about it because it has the opportunity to raise people's lives. It creates jobs. It provides them access to consumer goods, or it creates businesses that wouldn't have happened without trade. But I think what we're seeing now is we're those of us that have worked with multilateral forums and multi-party agreements and approaches are seeing that while we've trusted those organizations and those approaches for a number of years, that in fact they haven't always served us well. And if we're being very honest and we're looking at the data, that there are people that have taken advantage of multilateral systems. And I think whether you agree or disagree with the approach of this administration, I think the fundamental recognition that multilateral approaches don't always work unless everyone plays by the rules. And how do we enforce those rules, I think, is going to be the big issue for us going forward over the next couple of years. The other point that I would make, because I have the opportunity, often we talk about trade, and a lot of it is sort of big T trade policy. But what I would kind of put a plug in for is the actual mechanics of doing trade. I spent the bulk of last week in Central America, my first visit actually to Honduras and to El Salvador, and spent a lot of time talking about the Central America Customs Union and the opportunities, particularly in Honduras and Guatemala, where they are looking at their customs processes, actually how you move trade, collect revenue, make sure things are safe for the citizens of those countries, and make sure that you are supporting economic activity in those countries. The opportunities are tremendous to facilitate trade that is safe and secure. And so I would encourage all of us, as we look in the next 10 to 20 years, to pay attention not just to the big P policy issues, big T trade issues, but actually get into the nuts and bolts of how we do trade that is supported by technology, supported by good logistics, supported by people who know what their responsibilities are in this arena.
May I?
Well, go ahead.
I know, we're out just to complement that, because one thing that for those of us that get into the international world, we realize that it is not the case in the United States, but in the majority of the countries, customs authorities represent the #1 collector of revenue for the governments. In our case, we're not. Our economy actually, trade represents maybe 25% of our economy. We're a large economy from the United States perspective. But for other countries, customs authorities are it, right? And so that has an impact on how trade gets implemented or not. And I think to your point, that conversation of it really is where I keep saying we're living a historic moment that is making us rethink of how do we look at trade in a good way, because trade does help increase and improve the economies of the countries. We just have to do it now very thoughtfully. And how do we make that impact? And logistics are very important. That's my UPS ad, but we do deliver.
Well, thank you all very much for your perspective. Let's give them a great round of applause. And before we let you go and let you off the hook, we have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, the audience, to ask any burning questions that you may have. This is a great opportunity to pick their brains. We have, as you can see, top-notch experts on trade policy. Yes.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for giving us all these tips and information. My name is Susana Norino, and I'm the president of Northern Virginia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And we're leading a trade mission next March, 2019. But before we do trade missions, I always travel to the country first, and we're focusing in Latin America, of course, because we are a Hispanic chamber. And I went to Colombia back in March of this year, and I saw tremendous potential in the secondary markets, especially Valle del Cauca, with the Port of Buenaventura, and everything that is happening there. And Colombia is a good partner of the United States. But for the longest time, I think the United States have seen more Asia, and the ROI for Colombia is not there. While Colombia is importing airplane parts and so forth and technology from the United States, in return, they're just exporting coffee and roses. And I think there is a tremendous potential for manufacturing in Colombia, the same as Chile and Peru, for example, that already has a trade agreement with the United States. What can you tell us about, the potential that Latin America has, and what can we do as in chambers of commerce to really promote the market over there.
Good question. Any of you?
So I'll be happy to take a start, because what I saw in Central America, and I know exist elsewhere, is that there are great opportunities. And but I think that we have to be smart about the way we do it and recognize the opportunities in agreements like CAFTA-DR to promote manufacturing and to build the trading relationships with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So in fact, the Western Hemisphere is a good counterbalance both for manufacturing and for trade movements to Asia.
And I will complement. So we have presence in Colombia. Latin America is a very interesting area of the world, has the largest number of trade agreements than the rest of the world. However, is one of the most ineffective and costly when you're moving cargo in between. And so Colombia, of course, is part of the Pacific Alliance. You have Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. The Pacific Alliance is a very interesting agreement. I invite you to read about it if you haven't, because it is really looking forward in making some changes. For example, which I think is fascinating, they have an electronic phytosanitary document that is accepted in the 4 countries only when entered one country once. I'm getting very nerdy here, but that's a big deal. I know I'm getting too much in the weeds, but that's a big deal. The biggest challenge, and we were at the Summit of the Americas, we were part of that, and I'm part of the Americans Business Dialogue and the co-chair of the Trade Facilitation Committee for the whole region. The biggest challenge is the need for more transparency and more automation of the processes. There's still corruption is a big problem in the region, and so as American U.S. companies, we have very strict laws that we have to follow through. I mean, rightfully so. And so that makes a big difference in countries when you want to expand. So I think as a chamber, your voice and your leadership on continuing to promote transparency, automation, and best practices that we're following that TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement from the WTO, that will help the region, because I agree with you, that potential is there. The largest e-commerce markets in Latin America are Mexico and Brazil. And Brazil is the most protectionist country in the region. So there's opportunities there.
And if I could just say that one of our 2nd or 3rd largest chapters of OWID is in Lima. So I'm very happy to talk to you about an upcoming conference that we're going to have in strategic partnerships in the future. The women in that chapter there, as opposed to being mostly lawyers and lobbyists, like we are in DC, focus a lot on the trade of goods and not only services. So it would be great to facilitate a partnership with you.
So I've led a few trade missions to Latin America, and I guess what I would say is sales and marketing. Just like you're talking about, you need to bring forth the opportunities. You need to work with the U.S. Embassy, the Commerce Department, and others at the embassy who have all that information, the American Chamber of Commerce, all the other groups. And I think it really just is about selling and bringing forth relevant information so people are comfortable. And then also giving them the overview of the regulatory environment. So I think that a lot of it is going to depend on your sales and marketing, your ability to sell that country in that area.
Great. One more question. Anyone else over there? No one else? Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Nice to meet you.
Good afternoon. It's such a privilege for the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute to be able to welcome our keynote speaker. We are so proud of her. The Honorable Jovita Carranza is the Treasurer of the United States. A Chicago native, she is today not only responsible for all the operations of the U.S. Mint, but a senior advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury, and she represents the Department of the Treasury in numerous very important boards throughout the United States government. The Treasurer, Jovita Carranza, previously served the administration of President George W. Bush as the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration. She had a distinguished career in an extraordinary company that we heard today, Maria Luisa, representing, UPS. When I read the biography of Treasurer Carranza, it's really inspiring to see, especially in an organization like CHLI that thinks and dreams and tries to contribute to the formation of future leaders. We see that a young woman joined UPS as a night shift box handler and worked her way up to be president of Latin American Caribbean operations. And later, and also the president of air operations, where she created cutting-edge reforms in packaging and processing for the company. We're so proud in South Florida of the fact that she received her MBA from the University of Miami in Coral Gables. And she continued studying, and she received certificates and studied in Paris in the INSEAD Business School, and also at Michigan State University and at the University of Chicago. Jovita Carranza, you inspire us with your life's achievements and what you have accomplished and what you signify for the United States of America, and especially for the Hispanic community. It is a great honor for the Congressional Hispanic leadership to welcome today Treasurer of the United States, Jovita Carranza.
The more I accomplish, the greater the scrutiny. And the greater the scrutiny, the expectations continue to grow. And so when I was growing up in politics, although I don't consider myself political, just a servant, I would attend these events. And I would say, I'd admire all the speakers and the panelists, and I said, someday it would be great to even be part of a panel. And then when I received this invitation, I was just ecstatic. Lee Avila knows because we've attended these events together. And I was always in the back of the room. But now I get to see you from the front of the room. Thank you. Thank you for the honor. I'm honored to join you all today to acknowledge the critical role women play in the global economy and to discuss pathways for accelerating economic development for women across the country. I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to address this audience during Hispanic Heritage Month and to celebrate the accomplishments and contributions of the Hispanic American community. Serving this administration, especially as a Latina, provides an important platform to represent the community that is such a big part of me. While there is no single Hispanic identity, there are attributes endemic to this community: hard work, sound ethics, commitment to education and advancement, embrace of faith, and an entrepreneurial spirit. I am particularly encouraged by the significant strides the Hispanic business community has made over the last few years. Growth in Hispanic-owned businesses is over twice the national average. Hispanic women-owned businesses are driving a lot of this growth, with the largest increase in women business ownership of any race of ethnic groups. Although the Hispanic community is prospering and flourishing, I know that we have much more ahead of us to strengthen our communities. I see my role in government as an instrument in bringing the American dream more in reach to make success achievable for anyone willing to try. When I was sworn in as Treasurer of the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury said that it was remarkable to live in a country where someone could go from learning the value of a dollar at a young age to one day putting her name on it, and to be even more specific, it is remarkable to live in a country of opportunity, to go from cashing checks as a bank teller to endorsing our nation's currency with my signature as U.S. Treasurer. Hallelujah. Amen. I hope my message today will have relevance to you, but if not, at least my name will be present in the contents of your wallets. As Treasurer, my primary objective is to boost economic growth and promote financial security in our country. Advancing economic opportunity for women is essential to fostering stability, resiliency, and prosperity across our nation. The administration recognizes that investing in women is one of the principal ways that we can extend our impact. I'd like to share a brief overview of one specific interagency initiative that will help women entrepreneurs across the country expand and scale their businesses. To set the context, from our last census, 2012, of the 30 million businesses in the U.S., less than a third were women-owned businesses. For revenues, the last census data showed revenues across all firms as an average of $6 million for employer firms and $47,000 for non-employers. Notably, revenues for women-owned businesses are $1.1 million for employer firms and $26,000 for non-employer firms. The Women's Digital Entrepreneurship Initiative seeks to bridge this market gap. The White House, in partnership with the Small Business Administration, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of Labor, aims to create a comprehensive modern learning experience for women that includes peer-to-peer learning and networking, as well as a robust online platform to provide educational resources and functional support for women entrepreneurs and business owners. Our goal is to bridge this market gap by providing women business owners with a targeted training to achieve business growth, you and I know it as the bottom line, to maximize revenue generation and job creation. This educational platform will specifically address the market gap by empowering women business owners with the resources and technical assistance necessary to succeed. Unlike others in the market, this platform was derived from a data-driven analysis of women-owned businesses and the specific obstacles that these organizations face. As a result, more women will continue creating opportunity for themselves, for their families, and for the broader American workforce and our burgeoning economy. The Women's Digital Entrepreneurship Initiative is one component of a holistic effort to continually empower more individuals through financial inclusion and financial education efforts across the federal government. My office is working not only to enhance economic opportunities across the nation, but also to improve and to expand access to quality financial literacy tools necessary to properly manage economic prosperity. Reforming and improving our national financial literacy strategy is essential to expand opportunities for underrepresented groups and encourage these populations to play a major role in shaping our economic growth narrative. As Treasurer, I serve as a Secretary's designee on the Financial Literacy and Education Commission. FLEC reform is focused on implementing best-in-class financial education tools and setting assessment standards for financial literacy in order to better meet the needs of our communities. Throughout the diligent stages of our reform, we met with over 75 stakeholders to help address 6 high-impact financial literacy areas that the FLEC is focused on improving. These are areas, concentrated on the average household balance sheet and the proportionate risk that these liabilities have on the broader economy. They include basic financial capability, housing, counseling, elementary and post-secondary education, retirement savings programs, investor education, and military and veterans programs. We not only assess content priorities across these categories, but also develop an accompanying initial set of performance measures and metrics related to each area. From financial disaster preparedness to access to credit, FLEC work bisects many groups across the country. We expect our reform initiative to optimize the ways in which the FLEC, Financial Literacy and Education Commission work, can better address the needs of these communities and support their economic viability. Our economy is now growing faster than it has in many years. The administration's agenda of cutting taxes, reforming our regulatory system, and rebalancing our trading relationships is working. Unemployment is historically low, especially among minorities and women. A key task now is to ensure that all Americans can participate in the economic renewal. FLEC will play a critical role in that effort. As it relates to the federal role, Treasury's outreach to stakeholders has revealed the need for the government to play a guiding role rather than attempt to directly reach Americans with financial education training. We look forward to working in partnership with state and local governments, nonprofits, and the private sector to help us achieve our vision of a more financially prepared population. I'm confident that the federal government can meaningfully improve the quality and reach of financial education activities by promoting best practices, sharing evidence-based solutions, and deploying policy actions in support of financial literacy. The government should be an essential partner, source of trusted information, and thought leader to the many Americans who aspire to make better financial choices for themselves, for their families, and for generations to come. I'd like to commend all of you in this room for your effort in stimulating economic progress and encouraging both diversity of thought and action. I am honored to have the opportunity to engage with you today. Regardless of cultural background, it is those who embrace the challenge of helping people become productive and prosperous that succeed in shaping their communities and earning the great legacies. Lo difícil no es llegar a la cima, sino jamás dejar de subir. Thank you for climbing with me.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you for those wonderful remarks. We do have a little token of appreciation. I just don't know where it is. So hold on. I'm gonna ask you if you can please come up to the podium and the chairman to please join me in this little gift from Chile. Thank you. I'm going to ask the photographer to get a photo of this. ¿Qué traes allí?
Dinero.
Oh, you have money for us? Oh, I was going to take it away from her, but maybe,
I'll
that's
put it
too
right
fast.
here. I'll put it
Mírala.
right here.
Oh, my goodness.
Tengo que
Here you go.
cuidarlo, ¿no?
Yeah, claro. Okay, we'll move a little bit to your left, sir.
Yes.
All right. Here you go.
Qué mandona, ¿eh?
Well, hey. He said he liked that, so.
Perfecto.
Okay. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sí, gracias. Thank you. And I just was able to spare a few dollars from the Treasury for your
goodness,
board.
hilarious.
And here's a few dollars with my signature on it.
Oh,
so
my
thank
gosh.
You. Thank you.
You know who's really going to love this is my mom. She's going to love this. Okay, so let's see. We have to figure out which board members are here, right? Obviously, our treasurer gets one, and the audit committee chairman gets another one. So thank you very much. A couple of other people who I want to thank here is Manny Rosales. Where are you, dear? Over here. So I wanted to thank Manny and the Latino Coalition, which is one of our strategic partners. Every year when our board meets for an annual meeting, we go through a number of committees that we review, and one of them is always the organizations that we want to continue partnering with, as well as organizations that we want to extend and invite to be part of our CHLI Familia. The Latino Coalition has always been a big supporter, a big partner of ours, and I want to have the opportunity to say thank you publicly, as well as to recognize a group of business men and women who came from Mexico as part of the Latino Coalition's program and partnerships in Mexico, who wanted to very much be here and listen to the U.S. Treasurer. So thank you again. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde. Thank you. At this time, we have a little bit of a break, and so I was going to ask the Treasurer, would you be okay with a couple of questions? Okay. So I'm going to have a couple of people, and I'm going to help with the help you up here with the Q&A, so you don't have to manage all of that. You just have to answer questions, dear. That way, you know, we don't want the treasurer to have to call up the wrong name or anything like that, right? So if you can please keep your question related to trade, related to her job. Okay. Any other question, I will interrupt and I will not let her answer. Those are my rules. So, who's the first question? Okay. A ver, ¿qué es la pregunta? Please stand up and share your name and what company you're with.
So, my name is Luis Escareño, and I'm here today asking a question in the context of I'm the chair of the International Affairs Committee for the San Antonio Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. It's an honor to see you and to talk to you. Really encouraged by your discussion on financial literacy in our community. There's two things that we're focused on as a chamber. One is, how do you teach the next generation of children how to be entrepreneurs? And how do we teach financial literacy? So my question is, how does a community plug into the efforts of your office? Is there a how-to kit? How is it that we can plug into the kinds of things that you're talking about with respect to financial literacy in the Latino community?
Okay.
Yeah. So, excellent question. What we've done is convene. We have public meetings, 4 public meetings a year. And we have, I think, a mailing list of 22,000 people, Kelsey. And there are non-for-profits, there's state officials, there's also mayors that participate as well. We've had them attend our meeting. But if you look on the Financial Literacy and Education Commission, you can Google it very easily. But we're going to do a better job of reaching out to certain demographics that we believe are in great need of our expertise. And when I say expertise, we have 23 agencies associated with the FLEC organization, the commission. And we have about a budget, I'm going to say conservatively, about $275 million that's committed to financial literacy. We're looking at properly high impact deployment of those funds. But I look forward to reaching out to you personally in the sense that I lived in San Antonio for a couple of years, and I can appreciate the need there. So thank you. It's a good question.
So I have another question. Jovita Maria Luisa, Voice with UPS. Thank you so much. And it was really a pleasure to hear you. I wanted to ask you, we had a panel before about women in trade, and we talked about skill sets. It's kind of within the 2 topics, Marianne, that you gave us, but could you share what skill sets that you learned from UPS in your experience are helping you now as you're working in backing government and that are helping you from a leadership perspective and other business acumen perspective?
Great question. This is not a UPS plug by any means, okay? Okay. It's the question that was asked. After spending 30 years with United Parcel Service, I pray to God that something stuck with me, right? But even when I started out as a loader, unloader, and then supervised loaders and unloaders, I learned about the importance of quality and meeting productions. We had targets, and they had to be met, or you had to answer for it. And I learned about motivating teams. You know, I was part of a team. I was one of maybe 8 loaders, unloaders. And the wrap-up required everyone to complete their area of expertise or task. So I learned a lot about managing people at a very young age. But I learned a lot from my parents because they were very disciplinarian, so I was prepared for UPS's kind of regimented environment. What I also learned was to always take advantage of every training curriculum the company offered. And as my area of responsibility increased, the training associated with that level of responsibility I took full advantage of. I never was too busy to sign up for any of the training. And so that also instilled an understanding of how important training, lifetime training is. Because if you think a master's program is the final, no, it's not the final step to the journey. It's really acquiring knowledge on a daily basis. And what I also learned from United Process was they had very talented management people. And so as I was growing up in my career, I just tried to emulate the best that the company could offer. And that's what sharpened my skills as well. Thank you.
Time for one more question?
Yes.
Okay. No, muchísimas gracias otra vez. Thank you. Oh. Con permiso. Ya merito. De los amigos de México.
Sí, de México. Eugenio Salinas de Concamín y Comce en México. Thank you. Knowing now that, bueno, español, ¿verdad? Aquí podemos.
Como gusta usted.
Está bien, lo entiendo.
En español. Sí, ahora que estamos, por supuesto, con el tema de moda y que recientemente terminamos lo del acuerdo, ¿cuánta coordinación hay por parte de su departamento con los departamentos similares en otros países? Porque en México estamos muy atentos a cómo sobre todo suceden las cuestiones de la fortaleza del dólar y luego cómo afecta y que desgraciadamente ya hay muchas otras cuestiones externas. Y el propio tratado, si se recuerda, tenía ese concepto de una prerrogativa para lo de la manipulación de las monedas. ¿Cómo podemos interpretar eso? ¿Qué podemos esperar que siga después de esta última, le llamo yo modernización más que renegociación del tratado?
Currency?
Yes.
I'm not in that particular area, but that's not to retract from your question. There are various departments. You know, we deal with not only Treasury, but the federal banks and other agencies to coordinate that currency platform, you know, whether it's strong, weak, dollar, whatever the case may be. But at this point, it's not solely Treasury. We have coordination with other agencies as well.
In other countries
I
too?
couldn't address that. I couldn't tell you if we're engaged with the countries, but logically you would. But I can't tell you for a fact. Okay.
Because now it's very important since the peso and the dollar are so interacting around what's really happening in the trade negotiations.
Yes. Well, I have an aunt who visited me these past couple of weeks, and anytime the dollar gets stronger, she starts swearing at me. She says, yes, el peso, quién sabe qué. Pero, and I said, it's not the president, yeah. But tengo familia en México, y eso siempre están atentos de la fuerza del dólar, la fuerza del peso, y me cuentan de que ahora es 16, mañana es 19. Solo entiendo bien, pero no tengo la respuesta definitiva. Pero I can get back to you on that one, okay? Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much again. I appreciate it.
I don't know about Colin and Eric. For me, this is my first public appearance post-agreement on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. So we'll see. There's a lot in the agreement. There's a lot to digest. I did my best to read as much as I could between Sunday night and now, and when the site was up. So it's been, we'll sort of see. I think our comments are going to be a little raw. We're still sort of digesting the trilateral nature of it. We're still trying to figure out what all of our, in my case, what our companies think. But let me do a brief introduction because we can sort of take care of that first, and then when Karen gets here, we can get started. And I know she'll be here soon. So let me just get my notes out, because I have notes. So let me start with Colin. So Colin is to my left. So Colin's title is Minister Counselor for Trade and Economic Policy at the Canadian Embassy. Colin has a very distinguished career in the Canadian government. I won't go into all the details, but he's very familiar with the NAFTA. He actually served as counsel to the NAFTA Secretariat, which is the trilateral body that sort of makes the agreement run on a day-to-day basis and deals with a lot of the disputes. So he's very familiar with that. He's also a lawyer, and he's represented Canada before dispute settlement panels and appellate body proceedings in Geneva at the World Trade Organization. So we will direct all our dispute settlement questions to him. He has, as many Canadians do, been educated in both countries. So he has a law degree from University of Ottawa, but he has his bachelor's degree from Harvard. So welcome to Colin. Eric is he leads the Washington office of Council of the Americas and the Americas Society, and he's done this since 2003. So that in my world, that's a long time. I've had like 4 jobs since 2003. He began his career at the Department of State, and he had a distinguished career there. He also worked at USTR. And he served as a senior advisor to the White House Special Envoy for the Americas. So if you know anything about the history of the U.S. relationship with the Americas, there's been a lot of discussion about different types of free trade agreements and sort of free trade areas, and I know that Eric was involved with a lot of that. He also had a career on the Hill. He worked for Senator Sam Nunn. And personal favorite of mine is John Porter, who was my member of Congress when I was in high school, and so you worked for him as well, and I love John Porter. So welcome to Eric. Karen, there she is. Karen's here. She's Economic Counselor for Trade and NAFTA office at the Embassy of Mexico in Washington. She has worked for Mexico for most of her career, although she did also have some trade association experience. She worked at BSA Software Alliance. She also wrote a book, The Window to Europe, the Mexico-EU Free Trade Agreement. She wrote it with another distinguished trade person from Mexico. She has her undergraduate degree from Brandeis, and she has her master's degree from Stanford. Karen and I don't know, Eric, if you worked on NAFTA. Karen and I have the connection that we worked on the original NAFTA agreement. We were very young at the time. We were like 10, but we both helped work on the original agreement. So this whole discussion about having a new NAFTA and that's true. No child labor laws. Yes, that's right. But anyway, we know the agreement very well, and so it's interesting for us to be in this situation where we're looking at this new version. So welcome to the panelists, and I think I'll sit down, and we'll go from there. So can everybody hear me off? I know you're switching me over. So I thought rather than having everybody start out with a statement, a sort of opening statement, since we only have an hour and we're going to be interrupted by this cell phone thing, I thought we would just structure this more as a conversation, and I'm going to throw out questions for the first part of the panel, and then we will get to a point where you can ask questions. So I thought I would do my questions first, and I'll sort of direct the questions to different people. We'll get a conversation going. I hope that the panelists will feel like they can cross-respond as well. And then, as I said, we'll leave some time for questions from the audience, because I know a lot of you probably have questions, and these are the experts, and so this is where you want to direct your questions once we get there. But for the sort of opening question, I'd like to hear from each of you. Talk about what you think the sort of top 4 or 5 things that your government sees, and in Eric's case, business and sort of his members see as the most important sort of achievements of this USMCA. What do you guys each feel you want to sort of talk about and prioritize? When someone says, why is this good for the 3 countries, I want to know what people think. And I'm going to start with Colin, and then move to Karen, and I'll let Eric play cleanup.
Well, thank you very much, Vanessa, and it's great to be here. I think we had Chile at the embassy last year for this event, and glad that we can continue the relationship this year as well. So let me just maybe put it into the context from Canada's perspective. It's been a very exciting couple of years on trade for us. And so we have just last year entered into our agreement with the Europeans. We're in the stages of completing our TPP ratification or implementing legislation process through our parliament, with the hope that that goes into effect in early 2019. And then we've had the NAFTA negotiations consuming certainly my time over the last year. But from a Canadian perspective, that tells you how we want to position ourselves, right? We are with focus on sort of getting our fiscal fundamentals right in terms of getting being a platform which has access to Europe, which has access to Asia, and yet is rooted and has a solid, stable base to operate in our home continent as part of a trilateral NAFTA. That is our value proposition. That's how we come in to businesses with a story about our immigration laws being very much designed to facilitate business around the world. So we are a great platform, and that's how we position ourselves. So coming into this negotiation and how we have talked about it with Canadians, first for us it was a question of do no harm, and if you'll remember the context in the presidential election on both sides of the aisle was NAFTA was a bit of a dirty word. And so we realized that we hadn't done a lot of work that we should have been doing over 2 decades to explain the benefits of trade and how this trilateral agreement really benefits Americans. So that was sort of our first objective out of the gate. The other was that this is a golden opportunity from our perspective to modernize the agreement, to look at areas. My ambassador likes to say that when he 25 years ago when NAFTA was being negotiated, the Amazon was a river. The world has changed, so this was an opportunity to really get the digital economy in there, to think about how we actually engage small and medium-sized businesses in the business of international trade, to update the intellectual property and services elements of the agreement, to really focus on North American competitiveness. And so this is a relationship that I think all 3 countries took a little bit too much for granted. And from our perspective, it was an opportunity to really modernize the agreement. The other element that I think from a Canadian perspective is that we've done a really good job of building a domestic consensus on behalf of trade. And part of that has been explaining to Canadians how free trade actually works for our economy. It also is about reflecting different groups within our societies that they see themselves reflected in our trade agreements. So we have our progressive trade agreement, where we really take seriously some of the concerns that labor constituencies, looking at the role that indigenous people in our country can play in trade and how that can help their prosperity. That we recognize that there's a gender disparity in terms of how the international trading system works. And so if you're looking at this agreement, from our perspective, it was a very long weekend. But we really sort of focused on the do no harm, and that's really about trying to ensure that there's enforceability. For us, the biggest source of sort of unpredictability in the North American market has remained trade remedies. And so having a system that focuses those tools on the truly bad actors in the international space has been important, and that it has the social license because we're following our domestic laws in applying it. So that was a major concern for us, that we preserve that basic stability in our relationship, particularly with the United States. So that when you look at how we came in, there was some challenges, as I think everyone is aware, that usually you come into a trade negotiation after you've done a scoping exercise with your partners, and you all have the same direction that you're looking for reducing barriers, you're looking for predictability and consistency for your businesses. That wasn't necessarily a shared agenda coming out of the gate. So a lot of the first work that we did was around this modernization agenda, getting that right. And then we started to get into some of the more challenging areas. And from Canada's perspective, we actually found a bit of an alignment of interest with the United States around these progressive trade elements, because although Ambassador Lighthizer works for the president, and that's his audience, he also knows that to deliver for his president, he needs to get an agreement through Congress. And so when we focus on labor enforcement and environmental enforcement in this agreement, and when we bring in some of these elements that are part of our trade agenda, we think, and I think from the perspective of USTR, it helps do what we've done so well in Canada, which is build a constituency for trade. And I think you see in the product that was sort of unveiled at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, a real concern for some of those elements. I'll leave it there.
Karen, ball tossed.
Thank you. Well received. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. By the way, I'm Mexican and I was not late. So I was on time.
I thought you were standing me up, actually, because last week I canceled and left you on the altar, but this week is okay.
I was on time. You started early. So I'm going to do some very general comments, and we can get more into the weeds if you'd like with questions and answers, but I want to give everybody a chance to speak and give you a little bit like the 40,000-foot view of where we are. Clearly, we share the view that this was an atypical negotiation. It was atypical both in terms of the vision. I think, I've participated in a number of trade negotiations, and rarely have we come to a place where the parties have a very different vision of the value of trade and integration. So recognizing that certainly dictated the way that we negotiated, and it was very much a pragmatic negotiation. The other part of it is it was a very fast-paced negotiation. It might not seem like that to you all, but to conclude an agreement in a year is pretty record-breaking. We spent 7 months under very, having rounds every month. It was just super intense. And then for Mexico, like for Canada at the end of the day, the last 6 weeks were just nonstop here in Washington. And we produced, I think, overall, a good product. We committed to 4 pillars in our negotiation when the Secretary presented his letter to our Congress. Basically, they were, we need to preserve no backtracking in terms of market access. We want to have certainty for economic actors. We want to modernize, and we want this to be a more inclusive and progressive agreement. And I think on all those 4, we hit the mark. Certainty. So the rules and the dispute settlement mechanisms that are preserved in the agreement are precisely designed to give economic actors that certainty for long-term commitments. And I think that by coming to an agreement, we achieved that, and by preserving the dispute settlement mechanisms, including Chapter 19, which is the anti-dumping and subsidy dispute settlement mechanism, we do it. Market access, there is no increase in quotas, there's no increase in tariffs. We managed to eliminate, what was one of the leading objectives for Mexico, which was that seasonality provision, which would have treated Mexican produce or threatened Mexican produce access to the United States market. Was eliminated. So I think in terms of that, and given the importance and really the interdependence of our agricultural trade, that was one of the critical elements. We modernized the agreement. And many of you might look at it and say, well, it's kind of similar to TPP or CTPPP. And I'm like, well, duh, yeah. We only spent the last 5 years speaking to each other and trying to figure out, how do we do this in a way that North America remains competitive vis-a-vis other regions. So yes, there are many elements that are going to be similar. It's inclusive and progressive, and yes, it includes labor and environment, things that were not there 30 years ago, or they were there as a side agreement. But it also has, provisions on SOEs and small and medium-sized enterprises and an anti-corruption chapter. So there's a lot of wealth and novelty to it. I think that in the end, if you think about it from where we started, and I think, Colin, you make a very good point, that the U.S. administration came out with proposals that were very much at odds or different in their vision of where we wanted to land and what we achieved. I think we did well.
Okay. Eric?
Sounds good to me, what they said. Next question. No, Vanessa, thanks very much. And Chile, to you, thanks for having me back. I guess I didn't screw up too badly the last time I was a speaker here, and I got the invitation, and I was more than happy to accept, so thank you very much. But I do want to know who your photographer is from that picture, because that's a fabulous picture.
Thank you. Wasn't it great? It was an
wonderful.
impromptu picture that was taken. I don't look that good?
It's all about the NAFTA, isn't it?
It was at...
Karen and I go back. Actually, I was a NAFTA negotiator. I was 12, and Karen was 6 during those days. So
I'm hoping these photographers do me equal justice. It was at a speaking event in Virginia. Thank you.
It's one of those glamour shots. But anyway, it's all good. How do you follow that, ladies and gentlemen? Broadly speaking, as I mentioned, I do ascribe to what Colin and Karen have both said. They were negotiators. They were at the table. They were in the room. I was not. So let me give you just a couple impressions. And what I'm going to say is going to sound superficial, but I don't think it is. I think that's where we are in the politics of today. And I want to give you a couple points that matter in my view. Number one, Canada is part of the deal. We didn't know that Canada would be part of the deal until, what was it, 11:59 on Sunday?
Yep.
We started to get the glimmer Friday night.
We did get hints, yes.
That we had...
The lights were on at the Winter Building.
It was extraordinarily impressive how unified Washington was. Republicans and Democrats, business and labor, all the groups that normally would be opposed to each other in trade were unified on the point that Canada had to be part of the deal. And finally, Canada came onto the deal. That matters, because when we talk about trying to get this thing through Congress, which is a whole other topic, and we can, I'm probably less optimistic on that aspect than about what's actually in the agreement at this point. But it matters. And now people can rally around the idea that once again, even though we've changed the name, this is still about North America. And that, to me, is fundamental. 2 separate bilateral agreements, in my view, and in the view of many of our members, are a complete non-starter because of the way supply chains have developed, because of the way that the global economy has developed in terms of competitiveness issues, regulatory structures, all the things that make trade work or not work in the modern era. That is fundamental. Canada's part of it. The second superficial point, but it's not superficial, the name has changed, right? It's gone from NAFTA to the USMCA, which the trade isn't even in the agreement. It isn't even the title, US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Well, agreement on what? It could be agreement on anything, but it's a trade agreement. And why does this matter? I can tell you as somebody who has been literally and figuratively in the trenches in support of NAFTA since before it was passed, that NAFTA, even though it has 4 letters, is actually 5 letters, actually a 4-letter word. People hate NAFTA. They don't know what it is. They don't know what's in it, but they know it's ruined their lives. And they know that passionately, that NAFTA is responsible for their lives, their children's lives being destroyed, their community being destroyed, and people in their community being on opioids. And that is NAFTA's fault. And if you think I'm exaggerating, go to talk to my in-laws in Cincinnati, Ohio, or other places. I'm not exaggerating. NAFTA is responsible for so many things in the mind of the popular wisdom. Okay, so Fair enough. That's the battle that Colin was talking about. We haven't done a good job collectively telling our people and showing our people and working with our people to understand the benefits of trade. But the name has changed now. There's no NAFTA, ladies and gentlemen, if this passes, if the USMCA passes. There's no NAFTA. So the next time you hear somebody say NAFTA wrecked my economy, wrecked my life, you know, NAFTA needs, okay, there's no NAFTA, right? And it sounds ludicrous to say it, but that is the level of conversation that oftentimes we have in various places, even in Washington, right? If you take that off the table, you can start talking about some of the substance, right? NAFTA is, you know, you just say NAFTA, it's like that alarm that we're all going to get in a couple minutes, right? The alarm bells go off, people run away, and they say, I don't want anything to do with it, much less ever vote in favor of it. So I think that's a very important point. Now, in terms of some of the substance, is it a perfect agreement? No. No compromise, no negotiation is ever perfect. Did it go forward in some areas? Yes. And all of you, depending on what sector you're involved with, would have your own views on wins and loses and successes and things like that. I would agree that the digital economy piece is a step forward. From the U.S. perspective, access to Canadian dairy is probably a pretty good thing. There are other aspects as well that I think are important. In my view, although I understand the politics behind it, the greater restrictions in the auto sector are probably not an advance from the perspective of competitiveness and from the perspective of consumer utility, to the extent you remember your Econ 101. What that means in practice is that the price of the next car that you buy will be higher. The price of the next car that you buy will be higher, even if it's a used car, because the used car market tracks the new car market. And if it's a mid-sized car, mid-range car, and you're a middle-class citizen, right, and you're going to buy a mid-range sedan, the price of that car, according to estimates, could go as much as $4,000 to $5,000 higher. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm in the nonprofit world. I don't have an extra $5,000 just lying around, you know, to buy another car, right, on top of what the car is going to cost. So I understand the politics. I understand why it was done, and I'm not even disagreeing with it. What I'm saying is that there are trade-offs here. Right? And the trade-off that was made was do more for certain producers at the cost of consumers. And I think this is a trade-off that we are going to see throughout the text in some ways. Having said that, to get a deal that holds the peace, that holds the negotiation together, holds the agreement together as a trilateral agreement, I think is fabulous. So the last thing I would leave you with in this initial conversation, this initial round, is let's not get, unless your sector is directly negatively impacted and it's a life, you know, it's a bet the farm type issue, let's not get hung up on the trees and miss the forest. We could have lost this entire thing. And in my view, that would have been, that's what we're comparing it against. We're not comparing the USMCA against the perfect agreement. We're comparing the USMCA against no agreement. And if you put it in that perspective, I think what our negotiator friends did was actually quite a remarkable thing.
So maybe just picking up on your point about the auto sector, and you know, we are trying to do a lot of very new and novel things in that sector, and I think the rollout of how the companies in that sector make use of the rules of origin is something that we're all going to have to be monitoring very closely. But I think it's very significant that for the first time we have labor value as part of the equation, because and in a way that can be an incentive for all three countries, is an important addition to what we've traditionally thought about in the free trade context, because the big rap on free trade agreements has always been, yes, they reduce barriers, they facilitate trade, capital can move to where it's most efficient, you get greater productivity as a result. But some of these distributional effects, does it promote a race to the bottom, or are we trying to encourage a race to the top? We now have, I think, a much stronger case to make that the mechanism, the structure that we're creating is at least attempting to do that. And I think one thing we should look at is we had, from both the Canadian, Mexican, and U.S. business perspective, a lot of anxiety when the sunset clause was first proposed, because it was any one of the three countries could have held this agreement hostage every 5 years, and its lifetime looked very precarious. We have, I think Mexico's phrase is it's now the sunrise clause, and it really addresses
Or a
that,
very slow sunset.
or-
Like 60 years of sunset, slowest sunset you've ever seen.
Well, what it does do is it allows us to pay attention to this agreement and make sure it's modernized over time. And so frankly, we would have liked to, we came into this agreement with very ambitious objectives on services and on government procurement. We would have liked to have taken some of those disciplines and created that access down at the provincial level in Canada and the state level in Mexico and the U.S. And they're given the time frame that we were in on this negotiation. Mexico and the United States were just not there, for example, on sub-federal procurement as being part of the fix now. But it does mean that we now know that we have a schedule on review where we can start making the case for why that kind of trade liberalism is in everyone's interest and build it into the next time we try to modernize this. Same thing with the auto rules. If there are problems as we are implementing those, because they are novel, we have an opportunity to make them right. That's my glass half full for the day.
I'll take it.
Karen, just since we're on this topic, I'd like you to say a few words about the labor chapter. There's a lot of attention being focused on that chapter, and in terms of how is that being received in Mexico? Let me say that.
It's actually being received quite well.
Okay.
Look, and as I said, the Mexico of today is very different than the Mexico when we started an NAFTA negotiation, not only because I was 10, but it was also because Mexico is now, fully engaged in the world economy. NAFTA 1 was our coming out party. It was Mexico's, how do we insert Mexico into the global economy, and how do we demonstrate to Mexicans and to the rest of the world, that we can compete and that we can be modern and that we are part of this world economy and live by those rules. Just 2 weeks ago, we ratified our commitments to the ILO. Labor provisions in the agreement, the fact that we can make them part of the, an integral part of the agreement is a reflection of how we've matured as a country, as a manufacturing country, as a service economy, as a civil society in and of itself. So these are not impositions, but rather, they reflect what Mexico is and what Mexicans want. And so from that standpoint, I think we're in a very different area. Clearly, Mexico, in terms of population, is numerous times that of Canada. We have a younger labor force. We have an increasingly skilled labor force. We have a very hardworking people. And we should leverage each other's complementarities, and competitive advantages. So if access to capital in the United States or Canada is where their strengths are, and we have the strength of people, we should be using them.
Okay, I'm going to pick up one specific part of the NAFTA, I think, the new NAFTA, the new USMCA, that I think is really going to be helpful to a lot of people in the room, and that is the customs valuation chapter. So my background is I'm a customs lawyer by training. I never took the broker's exam, but I could have passed it if I did. And I watched this chapter with a lot of interest because I thought that the TPP chapter on customs valuation was a huge step forward. And as far as I can tell, and I'd like you guys to react to this, I think the new chapter in this new agreement is really great. So talk a little bit about, if you could, just drill down a little bit about customs. I know we're going to have to talk on de minimis a little bit because we have to get there, but let's just talk a little bit about sort of what you, from the Canadian perspective and the Mexican perspective, what do you guys see as the sort of breakthrough benefits? And then Eric, if you could just sort of comment from the news perspective about this chapter and why this chapter is really sort of TPP plus, WTO plus, sort of getting us to a new standard on customs matters.
Well, I personally have avoided customs matters as much as I could in my career. So probably not the best person to speak to it, but I agree with you. It's a far better chapter, and if you look at it in combination with the good regulatory practices chapter, this is light years ahead of where we were. I think one of the things that we've also made real improvements that I think is going to be important for the customs brokers community in the rules of origin certificates of origin and that kind of
Right.
piece as well, which is going to be critical as we go forward. But I'll leave it to others to speak directly to customs.
We all come in with our biases, don't we?
We do.
Actually, I agree full-heartedly. The Customs and Trade Facilitation chapter is one of those areas where we've clearly, that this is a win for all because it addresses things like the electronic manifest, having same rules. In terms of what it does, for Mexico that shares this very long border with the United States, it codifies really a lot of the practices that we have been developing and moving towards in the last 30 years, but significantly over the last 18, really, since 9/11, pretty much. The cooperation between our customs agencies is huge. And what does that mean for businesses? For example, one of the things that is achieved is we're looking to have joint inspection sites, right? So you are a company, you're bringing your goods across the border, you just don't have to go, first I go to them and then I go to them. It's just one, and you clear it all at once. And that's, for example, that's one of the elements that it is clearly a benefit because it reduces waiting times and time is money. So that's one example. There is a lot of cooperation across the board in that area, so we can get.
Yeah, just being able to encourage the single window initiatives directly in the NAFTA text, I think, is a step forward. So it's some of those pragmatic little steps that we have, because this was an agreement that was already well in place. The original NAFTA had some great features on rules of origin and customs. But now that if we can get this conversation done and out of the way, we also have an opportunity to get much more creative, I think, on issues like cargo pre-clearance, where you had very early statements, certainly by both Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump, that was an area that we should be really exploring as a way to get back into this conversation. So if we can change the NAFTA conversation from a four-letter word conversation
Right.
to one about pragmatism and how do we make our borders work better, it's a good place to be.
The first day of graduate school, I walked into the classroom and the professor put on the blackboard. We used blackboards in those days, Vanessa. I mean, that's when I was in graduate school.
You were only 5.
Yeah,
We did,
well,
yeah. I remember those days.
Actually, this was a green board, I think it was, but he used chalk. He put one word on the blackboard. It was implementation. And this was a graduate seminar about, U.S. governance and how things work and everything else. And the bottom line, and we learned this throughout the semester, and we didn't actually learn it the first day, but he used it as the baseline for the entire semester. It does not matter how perfect the legislation is on any topic if it's not implemented effectively. It doesn't matter. And when it comes to things like customs and cross-border facilitation and all these things, all of us have been around this game long enough to know that that depends on cooperation at the border. It depends on infrastructure that works. It depends on security agencies that talk to the commerce agencies and integrate and vice versa and don't see themselves siloed and independent of anything else. And it depends on trust and goodwill between sovereign governments, not just at the national level, but also at the state and local level. I've been to El Paso recently, I've been to Laredo, I've been to all along the border, from California to Texas, and on the Mexican side as well. And there are some communities that get this and do it really, really well because their lifeblood depends on it. And some of you are from those communities. And there are other communities that don't do it as well. And it's an economic, commercial issue, right? I mean, we might be all worried about security issues and everything in Washington and Mexico City and Ottawa. And the border, they're worried about, can the truck get across the border because my livelihood depends on this, my tax structure depends on it, and my community health and well-being depends on it. My point is that what's in NAFTA is an advance, yes, but we need to also continue the hard work, and it is hard work, among governments to improve the cross-border exchange and experience. And if you have one government or another government trying to politicize these issues, make them difficult for political reasons, it goes directly counter to the trends that the trade community wants to see in customs and trade facilitation. And so my point is that, we can talk about here, which provision here and which, chapter that, and it's wonderful and et cetera, and if it gets passed by Congress, great, nirvana. It has to be implemented, is my point. And so there are bigger issues here at a political level that I think are affecting all of us, and I think we have to be mindful of and underline all of the things that we're trying to do in the trade agenda. So, I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, I'm simply realistic to say that, the good, hard, important work of trade negotiators is something that I think we should all appreciate and do appreciate, but it doesn't stop there. I mean, there is a huge community response that's required. Let's take the good work of negotiators and let's implement it.
And I'm just going to add, because I want to add, I want this one to end on a higher note. There is already really, really good work. I mean, and I mentioned 9/11, but across the board. I mean, there was a tornado in the Nuevo Laredo border about a year ago, and it is a crucial crossing for automotive parts, and because there is such close collaboration, between our customs, both were able to redirect traffic and use other facilities very quickly, so that no company was going to suffer, the pain of having to fly their cargo as opposed to ship them through ground. So
I think Nuevo Laredo is a great example. I mean, that's like joint community where the communities literally see their futures linked. They happen to be divided by an artificial line, which is called the border, but is actually a living, breathing community on both sides of the border, and they get it because their livelihoods depend on it. I think it's a really good example.
Yeah, and just to play off that same idea, we just had the groundbreaking on the Gordie Howe Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. A third of the goods trade between Canada and the U.S. cross the Ambassador Bridge right now. So to be moving on that piece of infrastructure is the kind of thing that we should be turning our attention to. Because, I'm reminded of how back in 9/11, when the border was essentially shut for after 3 days, the car assembly lines in the United States Great Lakes ground to a halt. But we did manage to get sort of barges doing 24-hour moving of car parts across the river there. So that's the kind of cooperation that you get when you sort of put in place the methods of collaboration between the different services.
So we are going to turn to congressional issues, but I have one topic that I feel compelled to raise because my trade association follows this very closely. So we know that one of the things that wasn't resolved was the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. Tariffs have been in place since March 23rd. They're affecting significant numbers of U.S. companies that are users of steel and aluminum. Many of those companies are NFTC members, so I have a total prejudice view of this. But I would be curious if the two of you, and Eric, weigh in if you want, if you guys could just say a little bit about how that sort of parallel process influence the negotiations, or is still sort of relevant in terms of outcomes.
I'm going to take it first.
Who wants to start?
So I will start with a personal comment. I don't believe that Mexico or Canada present any kind of national security threat for the United States. And so I feel, we share the belief that U.S. prosperity and growth also helps Mexican prosperity and growth. We are looking to resolve this issue. We are hopeful, I guess would be the word, that we can come to some sort of an agreement before signing of the agreement. It is clearly on a separate track. We have had numerous conversations. As a result of this action, we had to suspend benefits on certain U.S. products. We take no pleasure in doing that, and hopefully we can resume to normalized trade soon.
So I echo all of that. I mean, these are clearly measures that that do not serve a national security purpose, and frankly, it has. Canadians are offended by the idea of being a national security threat. We have fought and died together on battlefields around the world. It's a very separate conversation for us, and I will be the voice of confidence. It's one that will get resolved because it's in every country's interest to resolve it, and we're looking to resolve it in as near a term as possible. One of the things we did do in the NAFTA context, and Mexico did as well, is to at least put the issue of auto tariffs to the side. In terms of future use of these national security investigations, we did put a provision into the agreement that says that if the U.S. is going to use national security investigations in the future, that it can't immediately apply to Canada, that there's a waiting period for discussion. And that might just look like a timing issue, but frankly, for us, it's much more important than that, because our experience is that often when the United States is upset at some offshore unfair trade practice, and so impose a Buy America provision or something like these 232 tariffs, the intention is not to hit Canada, but because we're the largest source of that product, we get hit, we get sideswiped. And then it becomes very difficult to withdraw it as it applies to Canada because of concerns about MFN approaches to things. This sets us up in an environment where we are not immediately incorporated into the measure.
I mean, and for those of you,
There it is.
sorry.
There it is.
218. President's watching.
So for those of you that are not on the weeds on this, I mean, just for perspective, is Mexico and Canada, first Canada and then Mexico, import 90% of U.S. steel exports. So we import 40%, Canada imports 50%. So just to give you a perspective of where things stand for us.
This is an area where, at least with Canada, the U.S. has a trade surplus, and which makes this all the more challenging. But fundamentally, both the initial measures and the countermeasures are having a drag on the U.S. economy. They're having a drag on North America. And I think there are creative solutions to this, and they will arise eventually.
I'm just going to make an editorial comment. So just to put this in perspective, the dairy access and the ag access that the U.S. agriculture industry achieves is being completely offset by the retaliatory tariffs, which I understand Canada put in place and Mexico put in place for valid reasons. But just to be clear, that you may have, that the NAFTA, that the administration can say that it had NAFTA wins on ag, but they're actually offset by the tariff retaliatory actions. So just to be clear as to where we end up, where the balance sheet is at the end of the day, not a net gain for U.S. ag in the short term, because you can have access, but if you can't really use it, it's not much of a benefit. Eric, thoughts?
No, I'll pass.
Okay. On that note, so let's move to legislation, legislative passage of these things. So I wanted to ask Colin and Karen to address their domestic procedures that need to be, so just everyone understands what the domestic procedures are, and then Eric and I get to deal with the congressional piece of this, which will be interesting. But I would like you could just briefly just go over your domestic procedures to talk about what you have left to do, and sort of to get us to sort of from here to entry into force, if we want to sort of look at that time frame.
Sure. So it's not nearly as complex as
No
what
doubt.
you're going to have to
No
explain.
doubt.
So in the Canadian context, it's very much an executive authority as to whether we enter into trade agreements. Our requirement on treaties is that they have to sit before our Parliament for 21 sitting days, but it is an executive decision. Implementing legislation has to go through our Parliament, but in the Canadian system of majority, of a government with a majority,
right.
They have the ability, generally speaking, to move legislation fairly expeditiously. One thing we don't do is that we don't bring an agreement into force until we have the capacity in our law, both at the federal and provincial level, to honor those obligations. And so there is that process of of examining the agreement, seeing if there's need for change at both the provincial and at the federal level. And we don't have agreements enter into force until we are in a place where we can actually fully implement. And I think in the U.S. system, there's also a requirement that the president certify that the trading partners are are able to meet their obligations.
So in Mexico, we have a very first, let's start. The Senate is the body that is responsible for approving our trade agreements. So it is only, it will only go to the Senate. But I would also add that we have a deep consultation process with our Congress. So throughout the negotiation process, we've kept them abreast of everything that has been going on. And just this week, we started consultations with the committees to brief them on the results of the agreement. So our undersecretary was before committees on this Monday. The secretary will be briefing the Senate next week, and we anticipate we will continue to be briefing them throughout. As far as when the agreement comes to consideration, trade agreements, I think after NAFTA stopped being as, the controversial issue for a vote. I think as a result of Mexico's opening to the world and seeing the benefits of really being an active and engaged partner, they stopped being controversial. So our free trade agreement with the European Union, which was approved in 2000, passed unanimously. We just recently, this April, were the first country to ratify our trade agreement, the CPTPP. We're active members of the Asia-Pacific Alliance. So I don't foresee, any kind of real trouble. And in large part as well, because as you all know, we had elections this July, and the Morena party, which is the president-elect's party, also got control of both houses in our Congress. And since the election, both the outgoing government and the incoming administration have worked and have briefed each other and kept each other abreast and have endorsed the idea of having a modernized agreement.
So Eric and I are jealous. So Eric, what's the next few months look like for us?
Let me pull out my crystal ball. No, we've got to wait 60 days before the agreement can be signed, according to U.S. legislation. That puts us November 30th, right before Mexico's inauguration, December 1st. But it also puts it after the U.S. midterms. And, I don't know what's going to happen in the midterm elections. You don't either. But a lot of people speculate that the Democrats could take one, if not both houses. The key thing to remember in all of this is 218. You need 218 votes in the U.S. House of Representatives. Doesn't matter where they come from, but you got to get to 218. And if the Democrats have majority control of the House, I'm not saying that number is easier or harder, but it's more complicated with an opposition Congress to a Republican White House. And whatever you think of the president or not, it's not my point. When I was in the Clinton White House in the 1990s, fast track expired. The Trade Negotiation Authority, the ability for the U.S. executive to negotiate new trade agreements. At that time, we were seeking FTA. We were seeking support for the FTA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, and we needed support from Congress to launch those negotiations. And Congress was controlled by Republicans. Obviously, President Clinton was Democrat. Republicans supported fast-track legislation. Republicans supported trade expansion. Republicans supported the Free Trade Area of the Americas. This was 1995 and bled into the re-elect campaign in 1996. Republicans refused to give President Clinton a renewal of fast-track trade negotiation authority for the entire end of his first term and the entire second term. And the U.S. executive did not receive fast-track from the Congress until President Bush was elected and in power in 2002. And then the next trade agreement that was brought forward passed by, what was it, 1 or 2 votes? Yeah. With a Republican Congress. My point is Republicans, which supported the agreement back in the 1990s, I know times have changed, but they certainly haven't gotten any easier. did not want to give a Democratic president a victory. Now fast forward to today and the potential of an opposition Congress and the Trump administration. And ask yourselves, are there 218 people who will take a vote in favor of a victory on trade for President Trump? And it's as simple as that. It doesn't matter what's in the text. It doesn't matter how magnificent the provisions are. It matters on if Congress wants to give the executive a victory. And maybe they do. I'm not saying they don't. But if we get to that point, it's going to take a huge amount of work, just like the original NAFTA did. Now, let me complicate your lives, all of our lives, a little bit further. Lest we think this is a Republican-Democrat issue, it's not. It is a globalizing versus less globalizing place, right? You cannot assume that every Republican in Congress is going to vote in favor of this, even with a Republican in the White House. Why? Because trade is a four-letter word. They have to go back to their own constituencies in 2020, and they have to go back to the base and say, I voted in favor of the successor to NAFTA, in favor of President Trump, and I want your vote for re-election. You have to look at it in this raw political term. Forget about, look, I'm a trade guy, I'm not a political guy, but you have to look at it in political terms because that's ultimately what you're asking people to do, is take a highly charged political vote during a highly charged political moment. And so, having said all that, Vanessa, and you asked me what's going to happen, I have no clue, but I would suggest that one possibility, one scenario, not to say likelihood, is that the current NAFTA is going to remain in force for a good long time because it's going to take a while for the U.S. political system to get to the point where they're going to take a vote on this agreement because they're not going to bring it up unless they have 218 votes in the bag, right? And that could take a good long time, particularly if a Democratic Congress, this is all speculation, it's all in the future, we don't know if it's going to happen, but particularly if a Democratic Congress is exercising its oversight authority to investigate the White House on all kinds of unrelated things unrelated to trade. So the cooperation on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue is going to be even that much more complicated. So where does that bring us? That brings us to scenario number 2. That brings us to the administration saying, I did the deal, I did what I was going to say, what I said I was going to do, we replaced NAFTA, Congress is not going to give me a win, but we're not going to keep the current NAFTA because that was the disaster in the first place, worst trade agreement ever negotiated, I'm not going to get the new one, what's my alternative? We rip up the existing NAFTA. And so we're right back to where we started a year ago before the trade negotiators got into a room and sweated it out and actually got a good agreement, right? You have the potential for the U.S. saying, enough. The current NAFTA, we wanted to replace it. Congress won't let me, won't let us. Boom, we're out of here. I don't think we can assume that this is a done deal in any stretch. And again, we congratulate the negotiators for the hard work they've done. I was one of them once, a long time ago. I get it. But at the political level, we cannot assume that this is a done deal, and we don't know what the timeline is going to be. Now, Vanessa, if that isn't pessimistic enough for you, I'm not sure what would be. But I hope that maybe you can talk some optimistic sense into what I've just said and balance the scales just a little bit. And let me emphasize, I'm not saying what my personal preference is. I'm not saying what I think, this or that party, or that's not my point. My point is you have to game this out in a political sense, and that's what I'm trying to do right now this afternoon.
And just to be more grim, I would suggest to you that I know Senator Grassley is saying he thinks this thing get done in lame duck. If you have looked at any of the timelines for what the Trade Promotion Authority Act requires be done between the time that the agreement is signed and between the time the agreement is voted on, there's a lot of stuff that has to get done. I'm not saying it's impossible because, bless their little hearts, the people at USTR are working night and day, giving up their vacations 24/7. I mean, they're working their little tails off, but there's still a lot that has to be done, and I'm just not convinced that it can all get done between now and the limited amount of legislative days that would be a lame duck session. So I understand what Senator Grassley is saying. I understand a lot of people are talking about that, but I would say to you, to the extent you're interested, dig into the statute a little bit. I'm happy to help you if you want to see the timelines. It's a pretty daunting set of tasks that have to be accomplished, including writing of an implementing bill, creation of a statement of administrative action. There is an ITC study that has to be finished. There are environmental and labor reports that have to be prepared, and all that has to be given to Ways and Means in Senate Finance before the vote. So if that's all going to happen between now and sometime in December, as I said, bless their little hearts. They're going to be working hard every day and every night, and that's still a lot to get done and give to the committees. And that's not even to talk about the political side of it. That's just the physical paperwork that has to go from USTR in our system, not in their systems, in our system, to the Congress in order for this document, this agreement, to have the proper paperwork and the backing that it needs to go forward under our statute. So it's very challenging any way you look at it. I promised at 2:30 I would open it for questions, and I've met my target. So if you have a question, if you could just stand and identify yourself and ask away, we'll take as many as we can, and I'll just sort of call people out. Go ahead.
Taking a little bit of the pessimism, hopefully, away from what it's looking like, I agree that there's a very short timeline and likelihood of this passing will be in the next Congress, which we don't know what it will look like just yet. However, and I think I can speak a little bit more having worked with Karen on things to the Mexican side and the U.S. side than the Canadian side, but I think lessons have been learned in the past, and I think, and I'd love to hear from you all if you think that there's been a much more positive outcome, whereas U.S. companies, like you have said, labor has not been outspoken on this. U.S. companies have been backing this, and I think a lot of the private sector has learned its lesson for maybe not have being as friendly to Democrats that did come over and vote, on NAFTA. Both Mexico and Canada kind of retreating a bit after NAFTA was done instead of being here. That I know Mexico has invested a lot of time being here, both the private and public sector, helping congressional members long before they're going to have to take a vote on this, understand what this means and things like that. Do you think any of this will pay off? Do you think, both countries kind of investing more time, the private sector understanding that they need to help congressional members that might take a potential bullet for this vote and things like that? Do you think that it will actually resonate? And that might be what helps get to 218.
So, taking your question and kind of addressing a little bit about what Eric and Vanessa said, I think to further fill your glass half full situation, one of the biggest differences is from a year ago is that even though NAFTA is a 4 or 5 letter word, when push comes to shove, people will say, well, I don't like NAFTA, but please don't get rid of NAFTA. And so I think it is, incumbent upon all of us that we work very hard to ensure that USMCA, that the old NAFTA goes away when the new agreement, USMCA, comes into force. And that is really something that is very important to continue to give the markets and the economic actors the certainty and the stability needed for them to make their business decisions and to ensure that the jobs that are being created remain. I do think that the work we've been doing is useful and helps, and there's a lot more to be done. At the end of the day, I might have to just agree with Eric that political decisions are not necessarily rational decisions, and while you can look, the Council on Foreign Relations from Chicago just released their recent poll yesterday or the day before, and it shows that there's like a 60% approval on NAFTA today. And that is up like 20 points from previous studies, and they've been doing this consistently. There is support for it, but it is a political vehicle, and at the end of the day, there are other elements that are coming into play.
Well, I think Karen's exactly right, but I would make a distinction between those who want the current agreement to continue and those that are being asked to take an affirmative vote in favor of its replacement. Yeah. And I think there is a fundamental difference there. If you're a congressperson and you are being asked to vote for this or not vote for it, the easiest answer there is delay, right? Push this off, let the public opinion coalesce around it. And the point that you're making, I think, is really important and a good one. Obviously, the business community, to the extent that they really dig into the agreement and like what's in there, and I think we don't know yet because it's a big fat agreement, and but there's investigation research that needs to be done. But to the extent that that's the case, sure, the business community will show up. One of the things that worked very well in the original NAFTA was the familiarization of U.S. legislators with Mexico in particular. I mean, most people sort of think we understand Canada. We really don't, but we kind of claim that we do, right? But we don't necessarily have a real familiarity with Mexico, at least those who aren't on the border areas or the border states. And one of the things that was quite effective was CODELs, right? Taking members of the U.S. Congress to Mexico and showing just precisely what Karen was saying. We're not talking about Mexico from 1810. We're talking about Mexico from, 1993. And it is a modernizing country with big aspirations, and we're talking now 25 years even after the original NAFTA. So to get people to Mexico in particular, but also to Canada, just not in January, to get them to those countries and understanding what, taking them to Querétaro, taking them to Guadalajara, taking them to some of the more vibrant, innovative sectors in Mexico, that changes minds and ultimately changes votes. But it's also a very long-term thing. Right? I mean, it takes a long time to organize. It takes a long time to get that impression to seep in and to sink in. So that's why my point is, it wouldn't be the end of the world if this vote didn't come up, tomorrow or in the lame duck or 3 days after the new Congress. Let that time build in. The unknowable about that is that going to be okay from the U.S. executive perspective, or will patience be lost and say, look, we tried, we're out of here, boom. And that's something that I think we can't ultimately know. So it is a risky proposition either way.
Yeah. Anyone who's been around U.S. trade policy for 20, 30 years would look at this scenario and say, there's no way, right? But the reality is that the apple cart has been upturned. The number of people in this town who say, I'm no longer in the prediction business is...
That's all of us.
is high. And I look at the comments from Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer this week. I look at the reaction from some of the labor constituencies. They were not predictable in terms of a regular agreement. And I do think, coming from Ambassador Lighthizer, there is a real interest and frankly, from my experience on the Hill, where 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you couldn't say NAFTA and get a hearing, now it's, I might vote against it, or I might have, I might hate it, but I'd hate to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And there's been, just like in Canada, NAFTA was not super popular before 2 years ago. Now you've got sort of all-party consensus on the importance of trade. There are changes in the ecosystem, and there are changes in the substance of the agreement, and how those all interrelate. I think it's very hard to take. Some of us are sort of the victims of too much expertise. Is one potential view of this.
All right. Oh, you two, you and then you.
I can speak louder. Oh, okay, it's fine. My name is Ricardo Rosa. I'm one of the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute's global leaders. My question is more for the American perspective. You mentioned, obviously, how this USMCA agreement has been a positive breakthrough, like a great result from the talks. But I feel we can't ignore the fact that this comes rather as a contrast from this trade war that has been going around, Trudeau putting tariffs. And I wanted to know, from the American perspective, what do you think it's kind of like the result of what we should be looking for with the European Union and that relationship that has been kind of rough in this administration?
Why don't you take that one?
Yeah, tariffs. Well, I think, look, this administration has found its favorite toy in trade, and the favorite toy is tariffs. Clearly, Ambassador Lighthizer and Peter Navarro and the President are the strongest voices sort of in the cabinet room on that, and I think they firmly believe that you create leverage by putting a tariff or a threat of tariff on someone, and then they come to the table and they want that pressure to be relieved, and they may be willing to negotiate more away than they would if the tariff wasn't there. So that's the calculation, right? You're building some leverage so you can extract sort of more in the trade-offs that happen in any trade negotiation. So I think, the Europeans have been very closely watching the NAFTA negotiations, as have the Japanese. These are cautionary tales. I think that the Koreans sort of maybe misplayed their hand a little bit as well and have sort of paid the price for that on the tariff side. I think it's a difficult game. But there's no question that this is not something that the administration is going to give up anytime soon. I tell my companies, this is the new normal. This is this issue of tariffs, and I think the fact that the Chinese are beginning to figure that out is relevant. I think the tariffs are with us, and they're going to be placed on imports for long periods of time. I don't think there's any short-term relief coming on any of them. And I think that that's just something that foreign governments have to figure out how to negotiate around. And I think, if you haven't seen the auto, there's side letters that talk about this 232 on autos. If you haven't seen them, I would suggest to you that they're one of the more interesting documents in the whole NAFTA package. But they do suggest that there's a way for governments to negotiate in some protection for a sector that is a subject of an investigation that would put tariffs on imports. And, there may be some sort of guidance in that to look at when you're thinking about this from the foreign government's perspective. Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Hedalia Vera from Inside Look TV. I wanted to ask you guys, in reference to NAFTA being such a big impact on the opioids, especially Mexico, with the new agreement, is there going to be something that Mexico's going to do to try to stop that? Is the new agreement going to, even though it's a different name, is there going to be something that they're going to be able to do to stop opioids from coming in?
I want to take Eric. I think you need to clarify your statement.
Fair enough. No, when I mentioned opioids, it wasn't that that's a result of NAFTA. It's that many of the things that are affecting, are being blamed on NAFTA because it's a convenient scapegoat. But having said that, I think it's an important question in this way. There are issues that you refer to that directly impact the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And if you look at that bilateral relationship broadly, there was a time when the U.S. and Mexico at the official level, at best, were kind of ignored each other, and at worst, were actively opposed to each other. That scenario has changed dramatically so that there is a daily interaction that is intense, it's cooperative, and it's throughout all levels of the bureaucracy. And one of the reasons why I said what I did at the beginning of this panel about, let's not lose the forest for the trees, is because with the replacement of NAFTA with USMCA in place, if we do indeed get it, the incentive for both Mexico and Canada, in my personal view, to cooperate with the United States across the full range of issues, including some very sensitive political issues and sensitive security issues, will be enhanced, or at the very least will not be reduced. There is nothing more sensitive in terms of that than drug trafficking and the fentanyl that's coming across the border and the opioid epidemic that is now a political real crisis in the United States. So from that perspective, are they directly related? No. Are they related in the context of trust and cooperation and the ability to work together to address an issue that is destroying segments of both of our countries? I would say yes, and that's a very important reason why I've been such a strong believer in the North American trading relationship anyway, because it's really a glue that in some ways holds together the much broader political and economic relationship that's facing us.
Last question, because she was so patient.
I know, thank you, Vanessa. Maria Luisa Boyce with UPS, and it's a pleasure to see all of you. I want to start maybe for the group on saying, because I told you in the panel that I've been drinking and eating NAFTA for the past year or two, but I do want to say...
Just drinking is fine.
Just drinking, I know. I was talking to my colleagues in Ottawa, okay, we have to figure out, we cannot lose the tequila or the maple syrup or the bourbon, so we have to figure it out. But I want to say thank you to Colin and to Karen for you guys to know the negotiations are so hard and their subject matter expertise was amazing doing the outreach and the negotiations. So do please give them when you applaud them at the end, give them an extra applause because they were amazing in the negotiations. And thank you so much, guys, for all the information. And Eric and Vanessa, because I don't want to leave them out.
That's
From their
okay.
association's perspective, always staying on top of all the topics and the issues and representing the industries are very important. So we thank them. And sometimes they have to say the things that we cannot say as companies. So from associations, thank you so much for that effort. From a UPS perspective, and wearing my CBP hat beforehand, I do want to emphasize what Karen said. There's a lot of interaction between customs authorities that we were doing with CBSA and with aduanas for many years that is allowing us. I think the agreement does bring that modernization language and reflects that agreement, that work that has been happening for the past, especially the past seven years. My question to Colin and Karen is, I'm an optimist. Eric knows this, and Vanessa, I'm more like a glass full, half full, not half empty. Yeah. So I think this too shall pass. We will get through it. My looking forward, though, is the implementation, right, and the regulatory implementation of what is agreed upon in the language. And I love how this agreement is the first one in the world that reflects very clearly TFA standards from the WTO, which is fascinating, right, from a cross-border practical implementation. How do you see, both of you see that challenge of implementing the language? What will be that process, and what will be your thoughts on it? Because it's going to be a very complex making it happen and then checking out that it is happening, right? The going back and checking the 75% rule or the labor piece. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about, now that you are sleeping and coming through this, what are the next steps once this passed to get implemented? Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of novel aspects to the agreement, and some of the certifications on the auto rules, for example. It's going to take a lot of work by some very bright people to get it right so that it does not actually create a disincentive to use the preference. We're already having really good conversations with our colleagues at the U.S. Department of Commerce about that next stage of how do you take the gains that we have with this agreement and start engaging with the business community and small and middle-sized enterprises to really take advantage of this relationship. But we've done a lot of sort of good pragmatic work in the shadows for years on good regulatory, on the Regulatory Cooperation Council, U.S.-Canada. There's a lot of mechanisms and there's a lot of conversations. The 5 years plus that you guys at least spent on the TPP before we even joined. There's been a lot of thinking through about how do you then take an agreement and implement it. And for Canada, because we are in this context of implementing CETA, implementing TPP, the rejuvenation of NAFTA, that puts a lot of interest within the government structures to actually, how do we make sure that companies are taking advantage of these new opportunities or old opportunities in new bottles. So I think you're going to see a lot of interest in working between the governments and outreach with business to say trade actually works. And I think you're going to be seeing a lot of, how do we build on this? This is not the be all and end all. Implementation is the word that belongs on the blackboard, and we want to bring it into reality.
I mean, trade facilitation is really important, and you, who has been, an integral part of the stakeholders involved, know how much we've invested over the years into doing this. So part of what it does is it will codify it. And then there's the specifics. So when there are some rules of origin that are stricter, and yet there are parts that are eliminated or simplified. So I was looking at the rules of origin. We're all really boring and nerdy for TVs, and they got simplified. So in some areas it might be a little more complex, and companies are going to have to invest. And I'm sure they already are, because we've spent the last year fully engaged with them and their trade associations in explaining of how do we land this and where are we. And then there's others that it's just going to be a little easier.
So if you'll indulge me, we'll have one question from the right.
Yes.
Hi there. You're hiding.
You never turn.
I know. It's the bad thing about me being this way. But you have a friend who sent me a note, so it's good.
I understand that we are a little bit in time. Eugenio Salinas with the Mexican Private Sector Advisory Committee, COMCE, CCE. Thank you very much. Very, very good information from each of you. Elaborating a little bit on what Eric said about the global repercussions. And it's another worry. I think we learned from this country 50 years ago, even now more, when you were the founders of the WTO, that we should engage into the multilateral system, that we should go for free trade. I think the only way that, again, the U.S. could still be the leader and show us is to really show it by passing. So do you think, Eric, that could be an argument for the whole country to say this is the way the United States still wants to lead with example to the world that we should follow, and not exactly the opposite, because then we will enter into the famous trade wars or even disrupting the WTO?
I think it's a hugely important question. I'm glad, Vanessa, that you took the last question. I mean, it's a really important question. I'm not going to satisfy you with my answer, unfortunately, because I don't think there is an answer, but let me try. Yeah, this is Washington. I've got an opinion. It doesn't matter if it's right. But the question that you're raising, look, at the technical level, we'll try to use any argument that works. So if this contributes to that, the short answer is yes, we would try that, and I happen to believe it. So, and I suspect that many of the people in this room also do. But the larger question is this a compelling reason for the American public? And on that question, I don't think I can give you an answer. We are not in normal times. We have many people in the United States that question whether the United States position in the role is actually the right thing to do. And we can come up with theories about why that's the case and how we got to where we are and these sorts of things. But I think there is the consensus that the U.S. has been the primary beneficiary of the global system that we, in fact, created along with our post-war allies. That is no longer consensus. I believe it. Many people do. But I don't think it is unquestioned at this point. And so the fact that we're taking a new look at existing trade agreements, but not just agreements, the entire system under which the agreements have been produced. That is a really tough thing. Now, when you put that in the context of other alternatives, which didn't exist at the end of the Second World War, but now do, namely China, but others as well, with markedly different views on what the international system should look like, and with the ability to help promote an alternative vision of global governance. Now when you have the United States meaningfully pulling back from global leadership, and you have a country that geostrategically and economically is capable of filling that void, it's not just a matter of the United States pulling back, it's now a substitution of a US-based system for one that is, the Chinese historically think of themselves in the middle of the universe. Well, maybe they actually will be again. And so I think the issues here are massively important. They're huge. And they're going to continue to resonate, and they're going to continue to grow. The system that was created, okay, it wasn't perfect. Maybe it didn't work all time for all people. But when you take that apart without a vision on how to reconstruct it, and there are others who are willing to do that for you, you end up in a far different place than you thought you might be. Does that message, for people like me who have a graduate, now I'm on my soapbox, ladies and gentlemen, but this is, for me, this is the crux of the matter. This is the crux of the matter as an international relations specialist and all this, does that message resonate with the American people to the extent that you now create a consensus that the United States needs to recapture a vision and pursue it at the, in terms of global leadership, not by ourselves, but with our allies and friends, people who share a vision. That, to me, I don't know. And I think we're going to learn a lot based on the next electoral cycles in this country There are still a lot of people who look at these things cynically and say, well, some of these things are being done just for votes, and the belief system is really not that different, and you make some cosmetic changes to this agreement, but at the end of the day, the agreement's fine, and the whole system continues onward. It really hasn't ended. I'm not so sure I ascribe to that, because it's like a sweater. It's like a knitted sweater. Once you start pulling on the thread that's loose, at some point the entire sweater begins to unravel. And it's really tough to put that back together again. So I think the question, as I said, I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer, but I think that it's a critically important question, and I do hope, speaking aspirationally, that my own country anyway will recapture a consensus that it's better for the United States and our future as a nation to be leading an effort to create and lead that international system than to be working to undermine it.
Can I just maybe add a perspective from North? The U.S. is going to have to decide whether a rules-based trading system with enforceable rules works for them, and I agree with you, it does. But one of the positive side effects, I think, of having raised the fundamental questions up, as this moment has, is that you're starting to see more leadership from outside the United States. I don't think we would have seen the Mexico-EU modernization of their agreement happen as quickly absent this moment. I think the Japan-EU, the real leadership that Japan showed in bringing the TPP-11 together and having that move forward as rapidly as it has, suggests that you're starting to see other actors in the international arena start to take more ownership of the system and responsibility for the system. And I think fundamentally, long-term, that'll be a good thing. I think we're all having to figure out, as the increasing prominence that China has in the international trading system, how to manage that reality. I am strongly of the personal view that the best way to manage that reality is to pursue the rules-based trading system that is the crowning jewel of American achievement in the post-war world. But that's, I think, it's right that we ask these challenging questions of the system and try to figure out how all of us can be part of the solution.
I agree with that.
On that note, that's pretty optimistic. Thank you all so much. Thanks to my panelists. Thanks, Karen, Eric, and Colin, so much for being willing to do this.
I want to thank all of our panelists. And yes, Karen, you were on time. So thank you all for being here. We have one last guest speaker, and it's really special for us because the House is not in session, and he still made his way up here. So I'm going to ask Marianne Gomez, President and CEO of CHLI, to introduce our last speaker, and afterwards we will enjoy our reception. But before you guys leave, we will ask if our board members who are here could join us for a last picture with the panelists, and also Rep. Flores. Thank you.
Where do you want us to stand? You can stay over here.
We have Angela, who else is there? Christina, Bernadette, from our advisory council and our board. Omar, where are you? Did I already miss you?
Stepped out really quick.
Oh, there you go. Both of you come up here. Go ahead and move these. And I'm going to ask, we'll do the one picture there. I'm going to ask. Nope. All right, and then don't move. Stay there. I'm going to have the Congressman, Bill Flores, at this end, and I'm going to scoot over to the other end.
All right.
So, as Juan mentioned, we have the opportunity to be joined by one of our congressional board members, Congressman Bill Flores of Texas. Shh. I know we're finishing up here, but if I could just have your attention just for a couple more minutes, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you. I love all the networking, but we're almost there. We're almost there. So Congressman Bill Flores is always been a very active and engaged board member. He's really more of a businessman on our board, not necessarily one of the members of Congress, because he's always been very engaged. We've had leadership conferences at his alma mater. He's had interns in his office. We had originally asked him to join us to do the opening remarks for our reception. But since he's here, I would like for him to address the group and kind of wrap it up for us, dear, if you don't mind. Perfect, thank you.
Well, good afternoon. So looks like we're down to the hardcore individuals here at the end. I didn't realize I was going to be the last speaker. And I want to say this, I'm glad we didn't try to schedule it this morning. My plane was trapped in Houston with fog. So I guess technically I'm not supposed to be here. I don't know if y'all paid attention to the congressional calendar, but we got scrubbed this week. So I came back just for y'all. And so I just wanted you to know that. So thank you. So it's, I want to thank CHLI for hosting this symposium. This is the 7th annual symposium that they've had on commercial issues, and I think there's no more relevant one to have today than trade, and then also women in trade. So I'd say really everybody in trade. CHLI does a fantastic job of putting these together. They get broad, diverse audiences, and I think they help stimulate thought. They do it without any ideological bias or adherence to one side of the aisle or the other, and it's really neat to be able to serve with my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to be part of CHLI as we move forward. When it comes to trade, I think that all of you would agree with me, we need to have free and fair trade. Now, what is free and fair trade? It means no tariffs, no barriers, no subsidies for anybody. And so that's, to me, what free and fair trade is. We have, for decades, our trading partners have taken advantage of the United States. And nobody has really stood up to do anything about it in a meaningful way. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't agree with the way the president has gone about doing this, because he's used, for lack of a better analogy, he gets a two before and then beats up our trading partner and says, okay, now that I have your attention, let's sit down and talk. But you've got to admit, the results have been good. Have they been perfect? No, but they've been good. And I think overall, we're setting ourselves on a better path for free and fair trade that has those three attributes that I talked about a minute ago. So I am, whereas the methodology was a little interesting, I think that the path we're on is really good for us. As a Texan, I'm really happy that we got NAFTA 2.0 or USMCA. I'm just going to say NAFTA 2. So that we got that squared away. I'm looking forward to reading the agreement and seeing what's in it. There's 1,700 pages, so it's going to take me a couple of days to get through it. But what I'm reading in terms of stakeholders that are involved in the international arena, most of them seem to be positive about what's happened with that. Some of the things you don't hear, so there's been a lot of press about that, and there's a lot of press about tariffs, but you haven't read a lot or heard a lot about the things that have actually happened that have been positive for this country in terms of these overarching trade discussions that have been carried out by this administration. So one of the things I'd say is many of you don't realize we've got a new trade agreement with South Korea. That's good for everybody. It's good for women, men, Hispanics, African Americans, Anglos. It's good for everybody. So we have a new one, and that should bring our trade deficit with South Korea down. We also have the beginning of an outline with the EU to try to put together better, more fair trade agreements than we have today. And then also, and I think the way the president was able to bring the EU to the table, because if you remember when those discussions got started, it was pretty rocky. And the way he got on the table is said, look, China is screwing y'all just as bad as they're screwing us. So let's sit down and work on a way so that we're trading fairly with each other, and then we can show, we can use our influence as the world's richest markets with, 50% of the economic activity in this world to help push China to come the right way. Another thing that you may not realize is in the last few weeks, we've had over a dozen new markets opened up, or new or closed markets for U.S. agricultural products. Pork, chicken, soybeans, you name it. I mean, you hear about the tariffs that China's put on our agricultural goods, but you haven't read about the new markets that have been opened up. Some are the first time ever. Some are open after being closed as far back as 2003. So again, another positive thing with the get tough or tough love approach in terms of dealing with trade. So I'm looking forward to how this continues to develop moving forward. From what I understand, there are good back channel conversations going on with the Chinese. We've got to stop the theft of our intellectual property. When I say ours, I mean everybody in the Western world has been getting their intellectual property stolen or expropriated by the Chinese. It's good to have a tough approach where people are working together so that we can stop this. And then I think if we do this right, it's going to be good for everybody, including China. The other thing you haven't heard about is the over 20 announcements of new steel and aluminum making capacity domestically. So if we can build the steel here, if we can build the aluminum here, those are Americans working in high-paid manufacturing jobs. We already know that there have been almost 200,000 new manufacturing jobs added just since January. But think about what we can do if these companies start investing back in U.S. steel making capacity and U.S. aluminum making capacity. So again, I'd like to bring this back full circle. It's the Texas largest trading partner with Mexico. And so I look at women that are executives in the workforce. I look at women that are entering the workforce today and thinking about how much of Texas commerce comes from trade, primarily with Mexico, but also with Canada. And I'm thinking it's going to be good for women as they are going through the senior part of their careers or as they're entering their careers. And so I think to the extent that we can rebalance the whole trade equation in this country, it's good for everybody, particularly women and other groups that have been unrepresented for years. So again, thank you for joining us today. I thank you for the invitation to join you at this symposium. I hope that the rest of the event is great today. Remember that we have a great country. It's under a little bit of stress right now. There's a little bit of division, so I'd ask you to spend some time praying for it. Pray for our military men and women that protect us so that we can have events like this, and also for our first responders that protect us here at home. Thank you. God bless you. So.
Thank you, Congressman Flores, for coming back to Washington and supporting us like you always do. And for last and all, thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure spending the time at this great event. Words cannot describe how proud I feel of my entire team, started with the President and CEO, to Michelle Archila, our Communications and Creative Manager, to Alicia Valdez, our Programs Assistant, to Rudy Vargas, our Administrator and Operations Manager, to our global leaders, and to every single one of you who made part of this amazing event. I invite you all to our next event, which will be November 14th. It will be the Value of Medicine, a briefing in Capitol Hill. And I also invite you to chair our Global Leaders Program. It's a program that definitely changes the lives of our future leaders. The deadline for this program is November 4th. So if you know any students that have the potential to be part of this amazing program, please contact us so that you share the information and that they apply. And once for all, I invite you to come downstairs. We have an amazing reception with dessert for all of you to enjoy. God bless you and thank you.